The town of Halverson had always been quiet, the kind of place where strangers passed through quickly, leaving only the faintest imprint of their presence. I was one of those strangers, passing through for work, temporarily renting a modest room above an old general store. The building creaked in the wind, and the wooden floorboards carried the faint smell of varnish and damp earth. It was a fine enough place, I thought. Quiet, forgettable. That first night, I heard footsteps. I had just settled into bed, the street lamp outside casting faint lines of light across the room. At first, the sound was faint, slow, deliberate steps coming from the floor below. I dismissed it as the shop owner closing up for the night. The footsteps stopped after a few minutes, and silence returned. The next morning, I asked Mr. Laramie, the store's owner, if he'd been downstairs late. He shook his head, his thin mouth curling into an amused smile. "No, sir. I close up at 9 sharp and head home. No one's down there after that." I laughed it off. Old buildings groaned, after all. Sounds carried strangely through wood and stone. But on the second night, the footsteps came again. They started at the front of the store, near the entrance, and slowly moved toward the back. This time, they didn't stop. They paced, back and forth, a measured rhythm that seemed almost purposeful. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear any other sounds, voices, the creak of a door, anything that might explain the noise. But the only sound was the steady thud of footsteps below. I stood, grabbed my phone, and crept to the staircase that led down to the shop. My hand hovered over the banister, hesitant. The steps continued, now accompanied by the faint scrape of something dragging against the floor. I flicked on the stairwell light. The moment the bulb illuminated the narrow wooden steps, the noises stopped. The silence was immediate and suffocating. I stood there, gripping the railing, staring down into the empty store below. The shadows seemed thicker than they should have been, pooling in the corners and stretching across the aisles of canned goods and dusty shelves. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking slightly. No answer. I descended slowly, my bare feet cold against the wooden steps. The air grew cooler as I reached the bottom, the faint smell of varnish giving way to something else, something metallic, almost like blood. The store was empty. I moved cautiously, checking every corner, even behind the counter where Mr. Laramie kept the cash register. Nothing. No signs of movement, no misplaced items, no dragged chairs or scuffed floors. Just rows of neatly stacked shelves and the low hum of the cooler in the back. I went back upstairs, locked my door, and spent the rest of the night awake, staring at the ceiling. The third night was different. The footsteps didn't come from below. I had barely turned off the light when I heard the sound. Soft at first, but unmistakable, coming from the hallway outside my door. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The steps were slow, deliberate, just like the ones downstairs, but this time they stopped directly in front of my room. The doorknob rattled. It wasn't violent, not the frantic shake of someone trying to break in. It was worse. It was quiet, almost gentle, a slow twist and release, over and over, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wanted me to know they were there. I stared at the door, my body frozen, every muscle locked in place. The rattling continued, patient and unyielding. When it finally stopped, I thought I could breathe again. Then came the tapping. It started low, near the base of the door, a faint, rhythmic knock that seemed to pulse in time with my racing heartbeat. It moved higher, inch by inch, until it reached the center of the door. Then, slowly, it began again, this time from the top, working its way down. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my phone, I opened the flashlight app and shone the beam toward the door. The tapping stopped instantly. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as I thought it was over, something slid under the door. A slip of paper, folded into a perfect square. I didn't move at first. I just stared at it, the pale square glowing faintly in the beam of my phone. When I finally worked up the nerve, I reached out and unfolded it. There was a single word written in the center of the page, scrawled in thick, uneven letters. Remember. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I tried to talk to Mr. Laramie again. He was sitting behind the counter, polishing an old clock with a soft cloth. When I told him about the noises, the footsteps, the note, he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read, somewhere between pity and unease. "Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" he asked. I wasn't sure of anything anymore. That night, I stayed awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with the lights on. Midnight came and went without incident. The room was quiet, too quiet. It wasn't until nearly 3 a.m. that I realized the silence wasn't normal. The faint hum of the street lamp outside was gone. The occasional creak of the building's settling had ceased. Even the ticking of the old wall clock had stopped, its hands frozen in place. And then, from the shadows of the room, came a voice. It was low, barely above a whisper, but it filled the entire space, pressing against my skin like static. "You were supposed to remember." I turned, my eyes darting toward the source of the sound. The figure was there, tall, featureless, its outline flickering like a projection on warped glass. It stepped forward, its movements disjointed, almost reluctant, as though it were being pulled against its will. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, the shadows around it deepening. "It's not what I want," it said, its voice splitting into echoes. "It's what you left behind." Before I could respond, the room shifted. The walls stretched outward, bending and warping until the space was unrecognizable. The bed was gone. The floor was gone. I was standing in a vast, endless expanse of gray, the air thick with the scent of varnish and metal. In the distance, I saw a door. It was small, unassuming, with a single word carved into its surface. "Remember." I stepped toward it, my body moving without my consent, drawn by a pull I couldn't resist. The figure followed, its presence a cold weight at my back. When I opened the door, the memory flooded back. But by then, it was already too late. The first letter arrived on a Thursday, slipped under the door while the morning coffee was still too hot to drink. Amelia wasn't expecting anything. No packages, no appointments. But there it was, folded neatly in an envelope without a stamp. The paper was heavy, slightly textured, as though it had been crafted by hand. Her name was written on the front in careful black ink, the kind of penmanship no one seemed to use anymore. She stood at the kitchen counter, the envelope balanced between her fingers. There was no return address, no postmark, nothing to suggest where it had come from or why. For a moment, she considered leaving it unopened. The world had been strange enough lately. Maybe she didn't need to invite more of it in. But curiosity has a way of undoing even the best intentions. She slipped her thumb under the flap and pulled the letter free. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for 2 words written in the same deliberate handwriting. "Look up." Amelia frowned, tilting the paper as if a change in angle might reveal some hidden text. It didn't. She glanced up instinctively, but her apartment ceiling looked the same as ever. Plain white paint, a faint water stain in the corner. She set the letter aside, its weight lingering in her thoughts longer than she wanted it to. The second letter came 2 days later, on Saturday. This time, it was waiting on her windowsill, though she hadn't opened the window in weeks. The envelope was identical to the first. Same handmade paper, same careful ink. But the message inside was different. Midnight. Come alone. Beneath the words was a sketch, rough but precise, of the bench in the park 2 blocks away. Amelia told herself she wouldn't go. People didn't get mysterious notes like this in real life, and if they did, it was never for a good reason. Still, as the clock neared midnight, she found herself putting on her coat, her pulse quickening in time with the click of her boots against the floor. The streets were quiet, the air heavy with the kind of cold that makes every sound feel sharper. When she reached the park, the bench was empty. She sat, her breath forming small clouds in the dark. The minutes stretched on, the silence around her interrupted only by the occasional rustle of leaves. She was about to leave when she noticed something on the ground near her feet, a small box, wrapped in brown paper. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. There was no writing this time, no clue as to what might be inside. She opened it there, beneath the flickering streetlight. Inside was a watch, its face cracked, the hands frozen at 12 o'clock. It was old, antique, maybe, but there was something familiar about it. Amelia couldn't place why, but it sent a faint shiver up her spine. Beneath the watch was another note. "You've worn this before." Amelia stared at the words, her mind racing. The handwriting was the same, but the message felt different this time. Less like an invitation, more like a statement. She looked around the park, half expecting someone to emerge from the shadows, but there was no one. Just her and the faint hum of the city beyond. She took the watch home, setting it on her nightstand. Sleep came uneasily, the cracked face of the watch seeming to glow faintly in the darkness. She dreamed of places she couldn't remember, a clock tower looming above her, its chimes echoing like thunder. When she woke, the watch was ticking. She didn't understand. She'd checked it the night before. It had been broken, unmoving. Now, the hands circled the face smoothly, as if it had never stopped. But it was wrong. The time wasn't right. It wasn't tracking the minutes or hours she knew. Instead, it seemed to move faster, the hands spinning through entire days and seconds. By the following week, the letters began arriving more frequently. Sometimes they were slipped under the door. Other times, she found them in places they couldn't possibly have been. A drawer she hadn't opened in months, the pocket of a jacket she hadn't worn since winter. Each note was a fragment, a whisper of something larger. Don't let it stop. The clock tower knows. You've been here before. She started to notice things in the corner of her vision. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't, the faint outline of a figure reflected in windows where no one should have been. The watch grew heavier each day, its ticking louder, more insistent. She thought about throwing it away, but the idea filled her with a fear she couldn't explain. It felt like part of her was tied to it, like losing the watch would mean losing something she couldn't get back. The final letter arrived exactly 1 week after the first. This time, it was waiting for her on her pillow, though she'd been alone in the apartment all day. The envelope was different, black instead of white, the ink a deep red that gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Inside was a single sentence: "The clock tower waits. Tonight." She didn't need directions. She'd seen it in her dreams enough to know the way. The clock tower wasn't on any map, but her feet carried her there as if they'd walked the path 1,000 times before. It rose against the sky like a jagged wound, its hands frozen at 12, just like the watch had been. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was thick, the smell of damp stone and rust filling her lungs. The walls were covered in carvings, symbols that looked eerily familiar, though she couldn't say why. The stairs spiraled upward, impossibly high, and she climbed them without hesitation, the sound of her footsteps swallowed by the heavy quiet. At the top, the mechanism of the clock tower groaned, its gears grinding against each other in slow, deliberate motion. The room was empty except for a single chair, placed directly beneath the massive clock face. On the chair sat another box. This time, she didn't hesitate. She opened it, her hands steady despite the weight of the moment. Inside was a second watch, identical to the one she carried, its face pristine, the hands ticking in perfect unison. She slipped it onto her wrist, and the room seemed to sigh. The clock tower began to chime. With each toll, the world shifted, the walls dissolving into light and shadow. The gears turned faster, the hands of the clock racing forward, and she felt herself pulled into their rhythm. Time wasn't linear here. It folded and stretched, unraveling in ways that made her head spin. And then it stopped. She stood in the middle of her apartment, the watch still ticking on her wrist. The letters were gone. The clock tower was gone. But the weight of what had happened lingered, a faint echo she couldn't shake. When she looked at the watch, the hands were moving backward now, counting down to something she couldn't name. When the elevator button for the 14th floor lit up by itself, I felt the first prickle of unease. It was late, long past the time when the office building's other tenants would have gone home. My cubicle sat in the corner of the 12th floor, and I was the only one left, finishing a report that had already stretched into a 2-hour overtime slog. I hadn't seen another soul for hours. The elevator wasn't supposed to stop on the 14th floor. The building directory didn't even list one. Superstition, I guessed. Many skyscrapers skipped the 13th floor, but this was the first time I'd seen a 14th omitted. The button shouldn't have existed, but as the elevator descended toward me, The glowing number didn't blink away, holding steady until the doors opened with a faint chime. No one was inside. I hesitated, peering into the empty car. The soft hum of machinery filled the silence, along with the faint, familiar scent of industrial cleaner. It looked normal enough. Ordinary steel walls. A cheap, scuffed floor. The faint reflection of my face in the panel. But when I stepped inside, the door didn't close. The 14th floor button was still lit. I jabbed at the button for the ground floor, but nothing happened. No sound, no movement, just the faint flickering of the panel lights overhead. Then the elevator began to move, not down, but up. The floor indicator climbed steadily past the 12th, the 13th, and then it stopped. The 14th floor button blinked once, then dimmed as the doors slid open. What lay beyond wasn't an office. At first glance, the hallway looked like every other floor in the building. Generic beige carpeting, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, numbered doors lining each side. But there was something off. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the light from the fixtures seemed dimmer here, struggling to push back shadows that pooled in the corners. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, far longer than the dimensions of the building allowed. I told myself to stay put, to wait until the elevator doors closed and carried me down to the safety of the ground floor. But I couldn't. My legs carried me forward, as if compelled by some invisible force, until the elevator chimed faintly behind me and the doors slid shut. The sound of them closing felt final. The carpet beneath my shoes was damp. The numbers on the doors were faded, their paint peeling as though left to weather for years. A faint murmur hung in the air, too low to decipher, like distant voices muffled behind layers of static. I passed one door and then another, their brass handles streaked with what looked like rust. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing against my skin, and I could feel a subtle vibration beneath my feet, as if the floor was alive, humming with barely contained energy. And then I heard it, a sound like breathing, slow and ragged, coming from just ahead. The hallway curved, and as I rounded the corner, I saw a door at the end. This one wasn't faded or rusted like the others. It was pristine, black and polished, the kind of door you'd find on the entrance to a private office or a penthouse suite. Something was moving behind it. The faint breathing grew louder, interspersed with a soft tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. The handle turned, slowly, but the door didn't open. Instead, a sliver of shadow pooled beneath the threshold, creeping outward in jagged tendrils that twitched like living things. I took a step back, then another, but the hallway behind me had changed. The elevator was gone. In its place, the hallway stretched endlessly, doors lining the walls like rows of broken teeth. The carpet was darker now, its dampness seeping through my shoes, and the murmur of voices had grown louder, shifting into what sounded like laughter. Low, guttural, and wrong. I ran. The air thickened as I moved, clinging to me like a living thing. The shadows beneath the black door surged forward, racing toward me like spilled ink. I didn't look back. My footsteps echoed as I sprinted down the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The laughter chased me, blending with the sound of the shadows as they slithered across the walls, the ceiling, closing the distance faster than I could run. Just as the darkness reached me, a door to my left swung open. The light pouring out was blinding, cutting through the shadows like a blade. Without thinking, I dove through the doorway, slamming it shut behind me. The silence was immediate. The air inside the room was different, clean, almost sterile, with none of the damp heaviness of the hallway. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, and saw that the room was empty. Empty, except for a desk. It was sleek and modern, made of dark wood, with a single lamp casting a pale circle of light across its surface. A piece of paper lay in the center of the desk, folded neatly in half. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't stop myself. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper. "You're not supposed to be here." A soft click made me freeze. The door behind me had unlocked itself. I didn't want to look, but I felt it. The presence beyond the door, pressing against the threshold like an animal testing the strength of a cage. The handle twisted, and the shadows began to seep through the crack beneath the door, slow and deliberate. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I grabbed the paper and ran to the opposite wall. There, hidden in the shadows, was another door, plain and unmarked. It swung open easily, revealing the familiar interior of the elevator. I jumped inside and slammed the button for the ground floor. The elevator shuddered, and for a moment, I thought it wouldn't move. Then, with a jolt, it began its descent. When the doors opened again, I was back on the ground floor. The hallway was empty, the lights buzzing softly overhead, and the air smelled like nothing more than floor cleaner. But the paper was still in my hand, and at the bottom of the note, a new line had appeared. You left the door open. When I first noticed the postcards, I thought nothing of them. They were tucked into the pages of a book he'd left on the coffee table, colorful little rectangles depicting places we'd never been. Rome, Kyoto, a misty beach in Ireland. They were blank on the back, no messages, no addresses, just the images. Where'd you get these? I asked, holding one up. He looked over from the kitchen, mid-sip of his coffee. Oh, those? Someone at work brought them in. Thought they'd make good bookmarks. It was a simple explanation, and I let it go. But over the next few weeks, I began to find more of them. One in the glove compartment of his car, another tucked under his pillow, a third, this time a view of a Parisian cafe, slipped into the pocket of his jacket. They didn't seem to belong to anyone or anything. They were just there, quiet and unassuming. One evening, I saw him writing something in a small, leather-bound notebook. He didn't usually keep a journal, and I couldn't help but ask, "What's that for?" He glanced up, smiled, and closed the book carefully, just jotting down some ideas for work. You know how my brain gets. It's like a sieve if I don't write stuff down. It was a good answer. Logical. But he was a software developer. Since when did coding require poetic scribbles in a leather notebook? I let the moment pass, but that notebook stayed with me. Weeks later, he said he had to go to a conference in Seattle. I helped him pack his suitcase, folding his shirts and tucking in a travel-sized toiletry kit. When I reached for his jacket, a small envelope fell from the pocket. My breath caught as I opened it. Inside was another postcard, this one showing a red suspension bridge at sunset. It wasn't the image that unsettled me. It was the message scrawled across the back. "I'll be thinking of you." No name, no signature, just that simple, loaded sentence. I didn't say anything at first. He was in the shower, humming to himself, and the sound felt so normal that I almost convinced myself it was nothing. But when he came out, towel slung over his shoulders, I held the card up. "What's this?" He froze, then gave me a half-smile. A joke from a coworker. They know I'm afraid of heights and keep teasing me about visiting the Golden Gate Bridge. I wanted to believe him. He laughed as he said it, his eyes crinkling at the corners the way they always did when he was amused. But something in his posture felt stiff, like a mannequin dressed in the shape of my husband. While he was gone, I found myself drawn to the little leather notebook. It sat on his nightstand, untouched, a tempting secret just waiting to be opened. I waited 3 days before I finally gave in. Inside, the pages were filled with sketches, beautiful, intricate drawings of places I didn't recognize. A cobblestone street lined with flowers, a lighthouse on a cliff, waves crashing below. Each image was accompanied by small notes written in the margins. The way her hair catches the light. Her laugh echoes here. The sea smells different with her beside me. I closed the book and sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. The drawings were too personal, too intimate, to be meaningless. They weren't about me. When he came back from Seattle, I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I followed him. He said he had to meet a client downtown, and I trailed behind him in my car, keeping just enough distance to go unnoticed. He parked near a small, boutique hotel, the kind we'd never stay in, too romantic, too quaint. I waited outside, my stomach in knots, as he went inside. He didn't come out for an hour. When he did, he wasn't alone. The woman with him was tall, elegant, with hair that shimmered like gold in the sunlight. They walked to a nearby cafe, talking easily, her laughter carrying through the air. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. The way he looked at her, soft, open, like she was the answer to a question he hadn't realized he'd been asking. told me everything. That night, when he came home, I was waiting for him. I laid the postcards on the table, one by one, each a small indictment. "What's this?" he asked, his voice tight. "You tell me." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he sighed, ran a hand through his hair, and sat down across from me. "It's complicated," he said finally. "No," I said, my voice sharp. "It's simple. Are you seeing her?" His silence was answer enough. I packed his things that night. As I folded his shirts into his suitcase, I found another postcard tucked into his drawer, a snow-covered cabin surrounded by pine trees. I didn't open it. He left the next morning, his shoulders hunched as he carried his bags to the car. He didn't say goodbye. Months later, I received a package in the mail. It was from him, though there was no return address. Inside was the leather notebook, its pages now blank, and a single postcard. A lighthouse on a cliff, the waves crashing below. On the back, he had written just 2 words, "I'm sorry." I burned the card and kept the notebook, filling its pages with my own stories. Stories of places I'd never been but might visit someday. Places where the air smelled of salt and the sea roared with endless possibility. The small house at the end of Millstone Road had been empty for years. It was the kind of place people avoided without realizing it, their gazes sliding off its crumbling shutters and peeling paint as though it didn't belong. The yard was overgrown, thick with weeds and vines that seemed to pull at the wooden frame of the house itself, as if the earth wanted it back. When I bought it, I told myself it was a project, a distraction from the hollow months following my brother's death, when my days felt like endless stretches of white noise. The house needed work, new wiring, fresh paint, a roof that wouldn't collapse in the next storm. It was perfect, I thought, because I needed work too. Something to fill the hours, to stop me from sitting alone in my apartment, replaying his last voicemail, the one I hadn't answered in time. The first thing I noticed about the house was the door to the basement. It was padlocked from the outside, the heavy brass lock dangling from a chain bolted into the doorframe. The real estate agent had shrugged when I asked about it, offering only vague assurances that it was probably just for safety, old houses and all that. I wasn't concerned. I didn't need a basement. I had no plans to store anything down there, no reason to ever open that door. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. The house smelled of mildew and rotting wood, but nothing a few open windows and a bucket of bleach couldn't fix. I spent my days stripping wallpaper, scraping layers of grime from the floors, and patching holes in the plaster. The work was hard, but it was good. It kept my mind busy, and at night I slept more soundly than I had in months. The first sign that something was wrong came late one night, when I woke to a sound I couldn't place. It was soft at first, a faint tapping, like rain against the window. But when I turned on the bedside lamp, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. The sound was inside the walls, faint and rhythmic, moving in slow, deliberate patterns. I lay there, heart pounding, listening as it crept from one end of the room to the other before fading into silence. I told myself it was the house settling. That's what old houses did, after all. They shifted, groaned, whispered in the night. But as the days passed, the noises grew more distinct. Tapping gave way to scratching, like claws scraping against wood, and sometimes I heard faint whispers, just on the edge of understanding. I stopped working after dark. I told myself it was to avoid accidents, but the truth was, I didn't want to be alone in the house when the shadows grew long and the walls came alive. One afternoon, I found a pile of dirt on the living room floor. It was small but strange, a perfect circle of loose soil in the middle of the room with no apparent source. I swept it up, thinking it must have been tracked in from outside. But the next day it was back, larger this time. When I moved the rug to clean beneath it, I found something worse. Claw marks etched into the wooden floorboards, deep and jagged, as though something had been trying to dig its way out. By then, I couldn't deny that something was wrong with the house. I started sleeping with a light on, my phone clutched in my hand, the number for the local locksmith already dialed. I avoided the basement door entirely. The lock, once a curiosity, had become a source of unease, its cold brass gleaming dully in the faint light of the hallway. Sometimes, when I walked past it, I thought I felt a breeze coming from the edges of the door, carrying with it a faint, acrid smell that made my stomach turn. The turning point came one night when I woke to the sound of something heavy moving downstairs. It wasn't the creaks or groans I'd grown accustomed to. This was deliberate, as though furniture was being dragged across the floor. I stayed frozen in bed, every instinct screaming at me not to move. But the sound continued, closer now, as if whatever was making it wanted me to hear. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps, loud enough to make the walls shudder. It came from the basement door. I couldn't move. My body felt leaden, my breath shallow and ragged. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, followed by a low, guttural sound that didn't belong in any human throat. I don't remember how I got through the night. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, I grabbed my keys and left the house, not bothering to lock the door behind me. I stayed with a friend for a few days, but the house wouldn't let me go. My dreams were filled with dark corridors and endless knocking, with whispers that grew louder and sharper until they became screams. I woke each morning drenched in sweat, my heart racing, a strange sense of longing pulling me back to Millstone Road. I returned on a gray, drizzling afternoon, telling myself I needed to face whatever was in that house, to put an end to it once and for all. The basement door was open when I arrived. The padlock lay on the floor, the chain coiled neatly beside it like a sleeping snake. The air was heavy, thick with the same acrid smell I'd noticed before. I should have turned and walked away, but something drew me forward, a force I couldn't explain. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the light from my phone barely piercing the darkness below. The basement was larger than I expected, the walls lined with crumbling stone and the floor covered in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room was a hole. It wasn't large, no wider than a manhole, but it was deep, its edges jagged and uneven. The smell was stronger here, sharp and metallic, and as I approached, I saw something glinting in the dim light. It was a handprint, pressed into the dust near the edge of the hole, the fingers long and impossibly thin. Before I could react, the air grew colder, and a sound rose from the hole, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Something moved in the darkness below, a shifting mass of shadow and teeth, and as it reached for me, I turned and ran. I don't remember climbing the stairs. I don't remember leaving the house. But I remember the sound of the door slamming behind me, the way the air seemed to ripple as though the house itself was breathing. I sold it within a week, taking a loss I couldn't afford, and moved halfway across the country. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the knocking again. 3 sharp raps, steady and deliberate, and I know that the house hasn't forgotten me. The letter was waiting on my desk when I got home. I didn't see it at first. I was too busy tossing my bag onto the couch and kicking off my shoes. But as I reached for the light switch, the dim glow from the street lamp outside caught the envelope's edge, highlighting its creamy texture and neat black script. It had no postage, no return address, just my name, written in sharp, deliberate handwriting. I picked it up, hesitating for a moment before sliding a finger under the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. "You are invited," it read. There was no other information. No location, no time, no sender. Just those 3 words, printed in the same meticulous script as the envelope. For some reason, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It sat on my desk for days, an odd weight on my mind. It was probably a mistake, I told myself, a prank, or junk mail dressed up as something mysterious. But I found myself glancing at it whenever I passed by, as though expecting it to change. The invitation stayed, unchanged and silent, until the 7th day. That evening, when I came home from work, I found a second envelope. This one was smaller, thinner, and bore no name. Inside was a ticket. It looked old, the kind of thing you'd see in a collector's album. Printed on faded cardstock, the ticket was stamped with intricate designs, swirling patterns that seemed to shift under the light. In the center, written in the same sharp handwriting, was a single line. Admittance, 1. Beneath it, in smaller letters, was the date, tonight. I should have ignored it, tossed it in the trash and forgotten the whole thing. But there was a pull, a strange gravity to the ticket that made it impossible to let go. By the time the clock struck 9, I was in my car, the ticket tucked into my coat pocket. The address printed on the ticket was unfamiliar, and my GPS didn't recognize it. But as I drove, the city seemed to guide me. The streets grew narrower, quieter, until the buildings gave way to overgrown lots and rows of skeletal trees. I arrived at a gate. It was wrought iron, tall and rusted, and it groaned loudly as I pushed it open. Beyond the gate was a path, lined with lanterns that flickered like fireflies. At the end of the path was the building. Calling it a theater felt wrong. It was too large, its walls too high, its shape too off. The angles seemed to bend slightly, as though they'd been sketched by an unsteady hand. Still, the doors were open, and the warm light spilling out was strangely inviting. Inside, the space was vast and echoing, its ceiling lost in shadows. Rows of chairs stretched out in perfect symmetry, all facing a stage draped in crimson curtains. The room was empty, save for a man in a suit standing near the entrance. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and precise. He extended a gloved hand. "Your ticket, please." I handed it over, my fingers brushing the cool leather of his glove. He nodded, gesturing toward the seats. "Enjoy the performance." I chose a seat near the middle, close enough to see the stage, but far enough to feel inconspicuous. The curtains remained closed, the room hushed except for the faint rustling of fabric as I adjusted in my chair. More people arrived, filtering in silently and taking their seats without a word. They didn't look at each other, or at me. Their faces were blank, their movements mechanical. The lights dimmed. A low hum filled the air, reverberating through the floor and up into my chest. It wasn't music, not quite, but it had a rhythm, a pulsing beat that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. The curtains parted. There was no actor, no set, no spotlight. Just the void. It stretched endlessly, a black so deep it seemed to swallow the light around it. And in the center of the void, something moved. It wasn't a person, or even a shape I could comprehend. It twisted and shifted, its edges constantly blurring, its presence filling the room with a weight that pressed against my skull. The hum grew louder, and I realized the sound wasn't coming from the stage. It was coming from the audience. I turned, horrified, as the people around me opened their mouths in unison. The hum poured out of them, their jaws stretching too wide, their eyes blank and unseeing. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't move. The weight of the sound pinned me to my seat, my body vibrating with the force of it. On the stage, the thing moved closer. The void expanded, spilling out into the room like ink spreading through water. It reached the first row of seats, swallowing the people there. They didn't scream. They didn't move. They simply dissolved into the darkness, their outlines fading like smudges on paper. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. The hum filled my head, louder and louder, until it was all I could hear. The thing was in front of me now. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and as it reached out, I finally understood the invitation. It wasn't for me. It was for it. The last thing I saw before the void consumed me was the man in the suit, standing by the door with a faint smile. "Enjoy the performance," he whispered. And then there was nothing. I didn't choose the house on Lantern Hollow. It chose me. When I moved to the little town for a new job, I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just something affordable and close to work. The rental market was sparse, so when I found an old craftsman home listed for half the price of anything else, I jumped on it. The landlord seemed relieved when I called. "You're the first to show interest in months," he said. There was a hesitation in his voice, but I chalked it up to the house being old and isolated, perched at the edge of a wooded cul-de-sac. Not exactly prime real estate. The house itself had character. That's the polite way to describe the creaky floorboards, peeling wallpaper, and faint scent of damp earth that never quite went away. But I liked it in a strange way. It felt forgotten, like a place waiting for someone to breathe life back into it. The first night, I noticed the lights. It started with the porch, a single bulb hanging from a chain, swaying faintly even though the air was still. The light flickered, not a steady rhythm, but erratic, almost intentional. I thought it might be a wiring issue, so I turned it off and went inside. Later, as I lay in bed, I saw another light through the window. At first, I thought it was the glow of headlights from a car at the end of the cul-de-sac, but it didn't move. It was a soft, amber glow, like a lantern swaying in the dark. I told myself it was nothing, just a neighbor, or maybe someone walking through the woods. But the nearest house was a quarter-mile away, and the light never faded. The next day, I found the book. It was tucked behind the kitchen radiator, dusty and warped from years of heat. The cover was plain, a deep brown leather with no title or markings. Inside, the pages were filled with hand-drawn diagrams and meticulous notes written in a cramped, spidery script. It wasn't a journal or a story. It was a record, a catalog of the house's previous tenants. Names, dates, and brief, cryptic observations about their time here. Some of the notes were harmless. Helen Abbott, 1927, claimed to hear voices in the walls. Moved out after 6 months. Daniel and Marcy Lowe, 1943, reported strange behavior in the cat. Left abruptly. But the later entries were more unsettling. Thomas Green, 1979, saw the light. Did not return. Unknown, 1996, the hollow took her. The most recent entry was dated 6 years ago. There was no name, just 2 words, still missing. I tried to convince myself it was some elaborate prank. Maybe a previous tenant had a twisted sense of humor. I left the book on the counter and went about my day, avoiding the porch as much as possible. That night, the light returned. This time, it was closer. It hovered just beyond the tree line, a steady glow that pulsed faintly, almost like it was breathing. I stood at the window, staring at it, unable to look away. It wasn't just light. It felt alive, watching me, waiting. The next morning, I decided to leave early for work. As I walked out to my car, I noticed something strange. The ground beneath the porch light was damp, even though it hadn't rained. There was no logical explanation for it, just a wet patch of dirt glistening in the morning sun. By the time I got home, the book was open on the dining table. I was sure I'd left it on the counter. A new entry had been added in the same spidery handwriting. Rachel Adams, 2023, watching. I didn't write that. I wanted to leave. I even packed a bag. But something stopped me. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like resignation. Like part of me knew that leaving wouldn't matter. Whatever was happening here wasn't confined to the house. It was tied to me now. The lights appeared earlier that evening, before the sun had even fully set. There were 2 this time, both swaying gently at the edge of the yard. I stepped onto the porch, the damp earth beneath my feet squelching as I moved closer. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice thin and unsteady. The lights didn't answer. They just drifted closer, their glow intensifying, revealing shapes within. At first, I thought they were lanterns, but as they moved, I realized they weren't objects. They were something else entirely. Shapes of light and shadow, flickering at the edges like flames. They weren't solid, but they weren't insubstantial either. I could see faint outlines, hands, faces, eyes staring back at me through the haze. And then they spoke. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. It was a low hum, resonating in my chest, forming words that weren't meant for human ears. The meaning seeped into my mind without explanation. "We've been waiting." I stepped back, but the damp earth beneath me felt heavier, as if it were pulling me down. Waiting for what? I whispered. The lights pulsed, their glow merging into one, brighter and more blinding than before. The hum grew louder, the words sharper, to be seen. And then I understood. The house wasn't just a house. It was a doorway. The lights weren't visitors. They were part of something larger, something ancient that lived beneath the hollow. The house had been its vessel, its way of reaching the surface, calling to those who lived within its walls. I don't remember what happened next. When I woke, I was lying in the yard, the grass slick with dew. The lights were gone, and the house loomed above me, dark and silent. Inside, the book was gone, as if it had never existed. But now, every time I close my eyes, I see them. Flickering lights in the distance, just waiting for me to look too long. The strange thing about the room was that it wasn't mine. It looked like mine. Same battered couch, same chipped coffee table, even the same old radiator humming faintly in the corner. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew it wasn't. The air felt heavier, charged, like the first few seconds before a thunderstorm. It smelled faintly of something metallic, something wrong. I'd come home from work, same as always, and found my apartment door unlocked. That wasn't unusual. I had a habit of forgetting to lock it in the morning rush, and I'd scolded myself 100 times for being careless. But when I stepped inside, I froze. Everything was there, just as I'd left it, but nothing felt like mine. The cushions on the couch were too neat. The books on the shelf stacked with an unfamiliar precision. Even the small scuff mark on the hardwood floor, from where I dropped a lamp last year, was gone. I backed out slowly, my pulse quickening. My first thought was that someone had broken in and cleaned the place, which made no sense. But before I could retreat fully, something caught my eye. A photo frame on the coffee table. It was of me. Not me. Exactly. The man in the photo looked like me. Same dark hair, same slight tilt to his smile, but his clothes were wrong. A suit and tie, crisp and tailored, not the casual button-ups I usually wore. And the woman standing next to him, smiling warmly, was a stranger. I didn't own this photo. I didn't know this woman, but I remembered her. I reached for the frame, hesitating as my fingers hovered above it. The memory wasn't sharp. It was fuzzy and distant, like something glimpsed through frosted glass. A name floated to the surface of my mind. Emma, and with it came a flood of emotions. Love, guilt, a deep, gnawing sadness. But I didn't know anyone named Emma. A sound snapped me out of my trance, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the hallway. I turned sharply, my hand gripping the edge of the table for balance. Hello? No answer. The tapping grew louder, closer. It wasn't footsteps exactly, but something heavier, slower. The air grew colder with each passing second, and I felt a pressure behind my eyes, like the start of a migraine. I stumbled into the hallway, the tapping reverberating around me, seeming to come from every direction. The walls were wrong. They looked like my apartment walls, but stretched, distorted, the edges bending subtly as if the hallway were breathing. And then I saw it. At the end of the corridor, where there should have been a blank wall, was a door. A door that didn't exist in my apartment. It was old, far older than the building itself, with warped wood and a tarnished brass handle. The tapping stopped as I approached, replaced by a low, pulsing hum that vibrated through my chest. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, but my feet moved on their own. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. The door opened before I touched it. Beyond it was a room I didn't recognize but felt like I should. It was small and sparse, with walls covered in peeling wallpaper and a single chair in the center. On the chair sat a figure, slumped forward, their face obscured by the shadows. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, the floor creaking under my weight. The hum grew louder, deeper, and the pressure in my head became unbearable. When I was close enough to touch the chair, the figure stirred. They raised their heads slowly, their movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet on worn strings. When I saw their face, I staggered backward. It was me, not just a reflection, not a doppelganger, me. But their eyes were sunken, lifeless, and their skin was pale and stretched too tightly over their bones. They opened their mouth, but instead of words, the hum poured out, filling the room with its terrible, vibrating resonance. I stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind me. The hallway was twisting now, the walls spiraling inward like the gullet of some massive creature. I ran, the ground shifting beneath my feet, the hum chasing me, growing louder with every step. When I burst through the front door, I found myself not in my apartment building's stairwell, but in the middle of a city street. A city I didn't recognize. The sky above was a sickly green, and the buildings loomed impossibly tall, their windows glowing with a pale, flickering light. The air was thick, filled with an acrid smell that made my throat burn. People moved around me, their faces blurred, their voices low and garbled like a warped recording. I turned in circles, disoriented and panicking. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. And then I saw her. Emma. She stood across the street, her features sharp and clear in contrast to the distorted world around her. She smiled faintly, tilting her head as if to say, "Come here." Without thinking, I stepped into the road, my focus locked on her. A horn blared. The world snapped back. I was in my apartment again, lying on the floor. The coffee table was overturned, the photo frame shattered beside me. My breathing was ragged, my body drenched in sweat. The door in the hallway was gone. The photo was back on the table the next morning, whole and pristine. The man in the suit smiled at me, his arm around Emma's shoulders. I burned it. The day after, it reappeared on the shelf, untouched by the flames. And at night, when the hum begins again, I know the door is still waiting. I can't explain why I kept going back to the diner. The food was average, the coffee burnt, and the fluorescent lights hummed like dying bees. But something about it felt magnetic, like it was stitched into my routine before I even realized I'd made one. It wasn't the staff either. Most of them didn't talk much, except for Cheryl, the waitress who always called me sweetheart in a tone that felt rehearsed. The customers weren't remarkable. Office workers hunched over coffee mugs, couples exchanging awkward silences, truckers watching the rain smear the windows. Yet every night after work, I'd find myself in that cracked vinyl booth by the window, staring at the menu I never really needed to read. The first time I noticed something strange, it wasn't obvious. A glass of water was already on my table when I sat down. "Thanks," I said to Cheryl, but she just raised an eyebrow. "You didn't ask for water," she replied, sliding a napkin my way. I frowned, but I let it go. It wasn't worth arguing over, and honestly, I'd been so tired lately that I couldn't trust my own memory. The second time, it was the salt shaker. It wasn't there when I sat down. Then, halfway through my meal, it was right in front of me, perfectly centered. I hadn't seen Cheryl bring it over. "Do you guys move stuff around while people are eating?" I asked, half joking. She gave me a blank stare. Why would we do that? It wasn't until the third night that I started to feel genuinely uneasy. I'd been staring out the window, watching the rain pool under the streetlights, when I noticed the man in the corner booth. He was middle-aged, wearing a suit that looked a little too formal for a place like this. I wouldn't have given him a second glance, except for one detail. He wasn't eating or drinking. He wasn't even pretending to look at a menu. He just sat there, hands folded on the table, staring at me. I turned away, trying to focus on my coffee, but when I looked back, he was still watching. "Hey, Cheryl," I called, keeping my voice light. "Who's the guy in the corner?" She glanced over her shoulder. "Which guy?" I pointed, but the booth was empty. She gave me a pitying smile, the kind you'd give someone who might be losing it. "Long day, sweetheart?" The rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I didn't go back for a week after that, but it wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. Each night, I felt the diner pulling at me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I dreamed of it, the hum of the fluorescent lights filling my ears, the smell of burnt coffee clogging my nose. In the dreams, the diner was empty except for me and the man in the suit. He never moved, never blinked, just stared. When I finally went back, I told myself it was to prove that nothing was wrong. It was busier that night. The clatter of dishes and low hum of conversation should have been comforting, but the air felt heavier somehow, thicker. Cheryl was there, cheerful as ever, though her voice sounded slightly off, like someone imitating her rather than the real thing. I ordered coffee, but when she brought it, the cup was already half empty. "I think you grabbed the wrong one," I said, frowning at the lipstick smudge on the rim. She didn't respond. She just stared at me, her smile frozen, before turning and walking away. I looked around, hoping to catch someone else's eye, but the other patrons seemed distant, like they were all slightly out of focus. The man in the suit was back, sitting in his usual booth. This time, I didn't look away. He stared at me for what felt like hours, and then, without moving his mouth, he spoke. "You don't belong here." My blood went cold. I stood abruptly, knocking over the coffee cup. It hit the table but didn't spill. The liquid inside stayed perfectly still, like it was frozen in place. I turned to leave, but the door wasn't there. The diner stretched endlessly in both directions, the booths repeating like a reflection in opposing mirrors. The patrons were gone. Even Cheryl had disappeared, though her cheerful hum lingered in the air, looping endlessly. The man in the suit stood now, his movements fluid but wrong, like a marionette guided by too many strings. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice too deep, too layered. I backed away, my feet sticking to the floor with every step. The lights flickered, and in the brief moments of darkness, I saw flashes of something. Shapes that didn't make sense, angles that bent where they shouldn't. When the lights stabilized, the man was inches from my face. His eyes weren't eyes anymore. They were black, empty voids, and yet I felt them pulling at me, dragging me down into their depths. "Sit down," he said. "You've already been served." I ran, my breath hitching as the diner warped around me. The booths twisted into jagged shapes, the walls rippling like liquid. The hum of the lights grew louder, almost deafening, and the smell of burnt coffee was replaced by something acrid, metallic. I don't know how I got out. One moment, I was running, and the next, I was on the sidewalk outside, gasping for air. The diner was gone. In its place was an empty lot, the ground cracked and overgrown with weeds. I haven't been able to find it since, but sometimes, when I walk past that corner, I catch a whiff of burnt coffee, and when I look into the glass of nearby storefronts, I see the reflection of a diner that shouldn't exist. Inside, a man in a suit is always watching. I didn't want the house. It wasn't a question of price. It was practically free, and it wasn't about the location. The house sat on a hill at the edge of town, surrounded by sprawling oak trees, their branches twisting like arthritic fingers. It was secluded, quiet, even picturesque in its own eerie way. But there was something about it that made my chest tighten the moment I saw it. The real estate agent laughed nervously when I asked why it had been on the market so long. "Old houses don't sell quickly," she said. "Needs a little love." I didn't love it. I barely liked it. But I needed a place to live, and the mortgage terms were almost suspiciously generous. The first thing I noticed after moving in was the door in the basement. It wasn't like the other doors in the house. Those were normal, painted white with brass knobs that squeaked when you turned them. This one was different, small, narrow, made of dark, unpolished wood. It was set into the basement wall, partially obscured by a rusted shelf piled high with old paint cans and tools. I wouldn't have thought much of it if it hadn't been locked. The keyhole was strange, jagged, the edges uneven as if it had been carved by hand. None of the keys the agent gave me fit. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a storage room or a bricked-off section of the house. I stopped going into the basement, but the house didn't let me forget about it. At night, when everything was still, I'd hear faint sounds, a low creak, like the settling of old wood, or the faint tap-tap of something light brushing against the walls. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, but only for a moment, and always too far away to be certain. The smell started about a week after I moved in. It wasn't constant, just the occasional whiff of something sour, metallic, almost like blood. It came and went, and no matter how much I cleaned, I couldn't find the source. Then there was the scratching. The first time I heard it, I was lying in bed, the house silent around me. It was faint, like the whisper of nails against wood, coming from somewhere deep below. I tried to convince myself it was just a mouse, maybe a raccoon that had gotten into the walls. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the basement, my heart pounding in my chest. The air down there was colder, heavy with the smell I'd been noticing for days. I moved the shelf aside, revealing the door. The scratching stopped. Up close, the wood was warped and splintered, as though something had been clawing at it from the inside. I leaned forward, trying to peer through the keyhole. There was something there. It wasn't clear, just the suggestion of movement, like the shadows on the other side were shifting. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The beam flickered across the floor, catching on a small, jagged object. A key. I don't know how it got there, but I recognized the shape immediately. It matched the irregular edges of the keyhole. My hand shook as I picked it up. I should have left, but something about that door felt like a challenge, like it was daring me to open it. The key slid in easily, the lock turning with a soft click. When I opened the door, there was no room on the other side. Just a staircase. The steps spiraled down, disappearing into darkness. The walls weren't wood or stone. They were smooth, black, and slightly damp, like something organic. I could feel the air shifting, colder and heavier with each step I took. The scratching started again, louder now, echoing from somewhere far below. It wasn't coming from a mouse or a raccoon. It was too deliberate, too precise. Halfway down, I felt it, the air growing thicker, harder to breathe. My skin prickled, the sensation of being watched settling over me like a weight. The scratching stopped abruptly. I froze, listening. Then, from the bottom of the stairs, came a voice. Hello? It sounded like me. Not just similar, exactly like me. The cadence, the tone, even the slight rasp I get when I'm nervous. Who's there? I called out, my voice trembling. The reply came almost instantly. Who's there? It mimicked me perfectly, every inflection, every hesitation. I backed up a step, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The beam flickered again, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move at the bottom of the stairs. A shape, indistinct and hunched. The voice called again, louder this time. Come closer. It wasn't mimicking anymore. The tone was wrong, stretched, almost playful. I turned and ran, the stairs creaking under my weight. The door slammed shut behind me before I could reach it. I don't remember how I got out of the basement. I just remember the sound of my own heartbeat, the way my legs ached as I sprinted up the stairs. The next morning, the door was gone. Not just locked, gone. The wall where it had been was smooth, as though no door had ever existed. But at night, I still hear the voice. It doesn't call from the basement anymore. Now, it's coming from the other side of my bedroom wall. The first time I saw the crack, I was stepping out of my apartment, arms full of groceries, keys dangling from my fingertips. It was there on the wall beside the elevator. A faint, jagged line running from the baseboard to about shoulder height. It wasn't there the day before, and the building was relatively new. No reason for cracks. I shifted the bags to my other arm, leaned closer, and traced it lightly with my finger. It was smooth, not like plaster breaking or paint flaking. It felt deliberate, like it had been drawn with a razor. When I pulled my hand back, I noticed my reflection in the elevator doors. For just a second, it didn't move with me. I turned quickly, heart pounding, but there was nothing unusual. Just my reflection staring back, perfectly in sync. My groceries felt heavier suddenly, and I told myself I was imagining things. Long workdays and not enough sleep could explain a lot. By the next morning, the crack had spread. I saw it as I was locking my door, my bag slung over one shoulder. The jagged line now reached the ceiling, branching off like veins, small splinters of it curling toward the corners of the hallway. I asked my neighbor, Clara, if she'd noticed it. She squinted at the wall, shrugged, and said, "What crack?" When I pointed, she just laughed nervously and said, "Maybe lay off the late nights, huh?" I let it go, but I couldn't stop thinking about her face when she said it. Not amused, but uneasy, like she didn't believe her own words. By the end of the week, the cracks were everywhere. They snaked through the lobby, curling around the ceiling lights and along the edge of the mailboxes. They webbed their way through the stairwell, winding between the steps and railings. No one else seemed to see them, or if they did, no one said a word. When I ran my hand along one of the larger cracks by the front door, I noticed something strange. The air on one side felt colder. Not by much, just a degree or two, but it was enough to make the hair on my arm rise. The faintest hum came from the crack now, so quiet it was almost inaudible, like the sound of electricity moving through wires. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to catch it better, and for just a moment, I thought I heard whispers. Not words, just the suggestion of voices layered on top of each other, overlapping in a way that made my stomach churn. That night, I dreamed of fractures. In the dream, the cracks weren't just on the walls, they were everywhere. They split the air like invisible lightning, faint threads of light tearing through the sky. The ground beneath me was riddled with them, glowing faintly, and every step I took sent vibrations through the earth. When I woke, The whispers were in my apartment. They weren't loud. They weren't even threatening. They just existed. A faint background noise, like the sound of wind slipping through a cracked window. I told myself it was nothing. But when I looked at the walls of my living room, the cracks had begun to creep there, too. That evening, after hours of trying to distract myself, I found a crack I hadn't noticed before. It was in the corner of my bedroom, right by the nightstand. Smaller than the others, thin as a hairline, but unmistakable. As I leaned closer to inspect it, something strange caught my eye. The light in my room seemed to bend near the crack, pulling inward. When I moved my hand closer, the tips of my fingers tingled, and I felt an odd pull, like the air itself was heavier near the fracture. And then I saw it, a sliver of something on the other side. It wasn't another room or the insulation of the wall. It was space. Empty, endless space, dark and vast, scattered with pinpricks of light that shifted as though alive. For a moment, I forgot to breathe, and then the crack widened. It wasn't gradual. It was instant, sharp, like glass breaking under pressure. The edges of the crack curled outward, and the hum I'd been hearing for days grew louder, resonating through the room. I stumbled back as the air seemed to rush toward the opening. Papers fluttered, a lamp on my dresser tilted, and the tingling at my fingertips spread to my entire body. From the other side, something moved. It wasn't a person or an object. It was an absence, an emptiness that shifted like a shadow caught in water. It filled the frame of the crack, spilling over slightly, and I could feel it watching me, though it didn't have eyes. I don't remember running, but the next thing I knew, I was in the hallway outside my apartment, panting and clutching my chest. When I finally worked up the courage to go back inside, the crack was gone. But the whispers weren't. Now they're louder. I see the cracks everywhere, on the bus, in the reflection of shop windows, along the edges of my computer screen. And sometimes, if I look closely, I see that emptiness again, pressing against the fractures, waiting for them to widen. I don't know what's on the other side, but it knows me. I didn't take the job because I wanted to. I took it because I needed it. I was a semester away from graduating, flat broke, and drowning in student loans when I found the posting. Live-in archivist needed. Historic estate. Room and board provided. $3,000 per month. It was more money than I'd ever seen offered for such a low-effort position. I sent my application without a second thought. The interview was over the phone, a clipped and impersonal exchange with a man who introduced himself as Mr. Voss. The job is simple, he said. You'll catalog documents and artifacts left by the estate's previous owner. The materials must not leave the house. Do you understand? Yes, I replied. He didn't ask if I had questions. A week later, I arrived at Holloway House. The estate was nestled deep in the woods, its wrought iron gates rusted but still imposing. The house loomed beyond them, 3 stories of dark stone and gabled roofs, its windows glittering in the late afternoon sun like watchful eyes. It looked like the kind of place that belonged in Gothic novels, not job listings. Mr. Voss met me at the front steps. He was tall and thin, his face pale and lined, with an expression that suggested he hadn't smiled in decades. The collection is in the library, he said, leading me through a dimly lit foyer that smelled faintly of cedar and something less pleasant. Your room is upstairs. Meals will be brought to you. You are not to explore the house outside of the library or your quarters. Do you understand? I nodded, feeling like I'd stepped into a dream, or maybe a nightmare. The library was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling shelves groaned under the weight of ancient tomes, their spines cracked and faded. Wooden ladders stretched up to a vaulted ceiling adorned with an intricate fresco of swirling constellations. A large oak desk dominated the center of the room, piled high with documents, maps, and artifacts. A single window overlooked the grounds, its thick glass distorting the view of the tangled woods beyond. Begin with the letters, Voss instructed, gesturing to a leather-bound box. They must be sorted chronologically. He left without another word. For the first few days, everything seemed straightforward. The letters were fascinating, written in looping, elegant script that spoke of family feuds, forbidden romances, and strange disappearances. They spanned centuries, their paper yellowed and brittle, their ink faded to sepia. But the deeper I delved into the collection, the more unsettling it became. The letters grew stranger, their subjects shifting from mundane matters to cryptic warnings. One read, "Do not open the door if it knocks after midnight." Another simply stated, "The watcher in the woods sees all." I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just the product of overactive imaginations from another era. But the unease lingered, like the feeling of being watched when you're alone. The first incident happened on my fifth night. I was at the desk, sorting through a stack of faded photographs, when I heard the knock. It was faint, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. 3 soft raps on the library door. I froze, my heart hammering. Voss hadn't mentioned visitors, and I'd seen no one else since my arrival. The knock came again, louder this time. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. There was no answer. I stood and approached the door cautiously. My hand hovered over the handle, but before I could turn it, the knocking stopped. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. That night, I locked my bedroom door and slept with the lights on. The next day, I found something new on the desk, a key. It was small and ornate, its surface blackened with age. I hadn't seen it the day before, and I had no idea where it had come from. Attached to it was a slip of paper that read, "The Attic." Voss had been explicit about not exploring the house, but the key burned in my pocket all day. By the time night fell, curiosity had overwhelmed caution. The attic was at the end of a narrow staircase, its door heavy and unmarked. The key fit perfectly, the lock turning with a soft click. Inside, the air was cold and dry, carrying the faint scent of dust and decay. The room was cavernous, its beams disappearing into shadow. In the center sat a single object, a large wooden chest. I approached it slowly, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The chest was covered in strange carvings, symbols that seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them. The lid was heavy, but it opened with a groan, revealing its contents, a mirror. It was oval, its frame made of dark wood, and its surface was impossibly clear, like liquid silver. But it didn't reflect the attic. It reflected something else. The image was faint at first, like fog rolling over a dark landscape. Slowly, details emerged, trees, twisted and gnarled, a sky streaked with crimson, and a figure standing in the distance. It was tall and thin, its silhouette sharp and angular, its head tilted as though studying me. As I stared, it began to move, stepping closer with deliberate, jerking movements. Its limbs were wrong, too long, bending in ways they shouldn't. I slammed the lid shut and ran, the key slipping from my pocket as I fled. The stairs seemed longer on the way down, the shadows stretching and twisting around me. When I finally reached the library, I locked the door and pushed the desk in front of it, my chest heaving. The next morning, Voss was waiting for me. "You opened it," he said, his tone devoid of accusation, as though he'd expected this all along. What was that?" I stammered. "In the mirror. What did I see?" Voss sighed, his expression almost pitying. "It saw you too." I left Holloway House that afternoon, abandoning the job, the letters, and everything else. But the mirror has stayed with me. Not literally. I left it in that cursed attic, but its image is burned into my mind. And sometimes, in the dark corners of my reflection, I see it again. That figure. Closer now. Always closer. It began when the clocks in my apartment stopped agreeing. I didn't notice at first. My mornings were usually a blur. It wasn't until I was halfway out the door that I realized the microwave said 8:03, the wall clock said 7:46, and my phone was stuck blinking 12 o'clock, as if I just plugged it in. I figured it was a power surge or something equally mundane, but when I tried to reset the time, my phone refused to cooperate. The moment I punched in the numbers, the screen froze. I chalked it up to a bug. Everything's buggy these days, right? But then it happened again. The next morning, my alarm didn't go off, and I woke to silence. Every clock in the apartment displayed a different time, not just by minutes but by hours. The oven said it was 3:22 p.m., the microwave 6:47 a.m., and my wall clock spun lazily backward, as though someone had wound it too tight. I was late for work, Obviously. My boss, who normally seemed thrilled by the opportunity to make me feel 2 inches tall, barely looked up when I arrived. "Don't worry about it," she said with a wave of her hand. That was the first real sign that something wasn't right. Later that day, I noticed the sunlight. It streamed through the office windows at an angle that didn't make sense. It was sharp, golden, the kind of light you only see just before sunset. But it was barely past noon. I stared at the shadows stretching across the floor, trying to convince myself I was overthinking it, that maybe a storm was coming, or the office glass was playing tricks on me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Ellie from marketing said, pausing at my desk. She didn't look at the sunlight. She looked at me. "Yeah," I said, though my throat felt tight. The next morning, I woke to find my apartment rearranged. Not dramatically. This wasn't some haunted house with furniture stacked on the ceiling, but just enough to make my stomach churn. My bookshelf was a few inches taller. The handle on my coffee mug was on the wrong side. My favorite hoodie, which I always kept on the chair by the door, was folded neatly in a drawer I hadn't opened in weeks. Sleepwalking, I whispered to myself, though I'd never been prone to it. "You're stressed. That's all." I reset the clocks again, for what little comfort it gave me. But when I stepped outside, the world wasn't how I'd left it. My building looked the same, but the street was stretched. The sidewalks seemed too wide, the lampposts spaced too far apart. The trees were taller, their branches drooping under the weight of too many leaves. And the sky wasn't the right color. It wasn't blue, or gray, or even something natural like overcast. It shimmered faintly, like an oil slick, colors blending and shifting in ways my brain couldn't quite process. I walked to the corner store, trying to tell myself I was imagining things, that I just needed caffeine. But when I stepped inside, the shelves were wrong. They weren't stocked with groceries, but with objects I couldn't name. Glass spheres that pulsed faintly, jars filled with something that looked like smoke. The cashier greeted me with a nod. She looked normal enough, except for her eyes. They were the same color as the sky. "Morning," she said, her voice too smooth. "Long night?" I left without buying anything. By the time I got back to my apartment, the clocks were gone. Not stopped or frozen, but completely missing. The microwave display was blank. The wall clock had vanished, leaving only a clean circle where the dust hadn't settled. My phone wouldn't turn on. That night, I dreamed of the sky. In the dream, it wasn't above me anymore. It was all around, pressing close, its colors churning like a living thing. I felt weightless, unmoored, my feet no longer touching solid ground. Voices whispered through the void, speaking in tones that weren't quite human. When I woke, I found a mark on my wrist. It wasn't a bruise, though it was faint and purple, almost translucent. It looked like a map, lines branching outward in delicate, looping patterns. It pulsed faintly, in time with a rhythm I couldn't hear, but felt deep in my chest. I tried scrubbing it off. It didn't budge. Ellie called me that afternoon. I almost didn't answer. I wasn't sure I could hold a normal conversation. But when I picked up, her voice was unusually soft. "Did you feel it?" she asked. "Feel what?" She hesitated. "It's not stopping, is it?" I didn't ask how she knew. I couldn't. That evening, I stepped outside again, and the city was gone. The streets stretched endlessly into the horizon, their edges blurred like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. Cars sat frozen in the middle of intersections, their colors muted. People moved in slow, jerky motions, their faces turned slightly away, as though they couldn't, or wouldn't, see me. When I tried speaking to them, their mouths moved, but no sound came out. The sky had darkened now, deep indigos and purples swirling together. It wasn't threatening, though. It felt alive, curious, its colors reaching out like tendrils. "Do you see it yet?" The voice came from behind me. I turned to find Ellie standing there, her eyes shimmering with the same unnatural light as the cashier's. "What's happening?" I asked, my voice trembling. She smiled faintly. "You're out of sync." "With what?" "Everything." Her words settled over me like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. The mark on my wrist pulsed again, brighter now, its lines stretching up my arm. I don't remember what happened next. I woke up in my apartment, though it wasn't really my apartment anymore. The walls seemed thinner, the air heavier. The clocks were back, but none of them displayed numbers. Just faint, glowing symbols that shifted whenever I tried to read them. The sky outside is still wrong, and the streets stretch endlessly into nowhere. Sometimes I hear the chimes again, faint and melodic, calling me towards something I can't yet see. And Ellie? She's in the mirror now, watching me, waiting. I didn't notice the cat at first. It blended into the clutter of my neighbor's overgrown yard, a black shape against the chaos of rusted bikes, empty plant pots, and sagging patio furniture. But as I carried the garbage out that morning, something made me pause. Its eyes caught mine, bright, yellow, and unnervingly steady. It wasn't just watching me. It was studying me. The cat sat perfectly still, its sleek fur glinting faintly in the pale autumn sunlight. I'd lived in this neighborhood for 6 years and never seen it before. It wasn't wearing a collar, but there was something about its composure that suggested it wasn't a stray. As I stood there, clutching the garbage bag, a peculiar chill ran through me, sharp and sudden, though the air was still. I waved a little, feeling stupid, and muttered, "Shoo." The cat didn't move. When I came back inside, it was still there, its gaze fixed on the front window like it could see me through the curtain. That night, I dreamed of it. In the dream, it wasn't sitting in my neighbor's yard anymore. It was inside my house. It moved from room to room with unnerving precision, its movements liquid and deliberate. I tried to follow it, but the house stretched and shifted, its hallways impossibly long and dim. I woke just before the cat reached my bedroom door, my chest tight and my throat dry. The cat was outside again the next morning, in the exact same spot, its eyes trained on me as though it hadn't moved all night. By the third day, I was starting to feel foolish. It was just a cat. Sure, it was weirdly still, but plenty of animals behaved strangely. I told myself it was nothing, just an overactive imagination fueled by stress and poor sleep. Still, I avoided looking at it. That evening, just as I was settling onto the couch with a book, I heard it, a soft, deliberate scratching at the front door. My pulse quickened. I ignored it at first, trying to convince myself it was just a branch in the wind. But the sound came again, more insistent this time. I opened the door. The cat was sitting on the welcome mat, its head tilted slightly to the side. It didn't flinch when the door swung open, nor did it try to run inside. It simply stared up at me, unblinking. For a moment, we both stayed there, frozen, and I felt that same peculiar chill wrap around my chest. And then it stood, turned, and padded silently down the porch steps. I don't know what compelled me to follow it. Maybe it was the strange confidence of its movements, or the faint sense of unease that had been gnawing at me since it first appeared. Whatever the reason, I slipped on my shoes and stepped into the cool night air, trailing behind it as it moved with unsettling purpose. The cat led me down the street, past darkened houses and empty sidewalks. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that amplifies every sound. The scuff of my shoes on the pavement, the soft rustle of leaves overhead. It didn't stop until we reached the edge of the neighborhood, where the asphalt gave way to a narrow dirt path I didn't recognize. I hesitated. The path snaked into the woods, where the shadows were thicker, the air colder. The cat stopped and turned to look at me, its eyes catching the faint light like twin embers. I could feel it waiting. Against every instinct, I followed. The path twisted and narrowed, the trees pressing closer until the world felt claustrophobic and damp. The ground beneath my feet grew softer, and the smell of earth and decaying leaves filled the air. I couldn't tell how far we'd gone. Minutes? Hours? Time felt strange, stretching and folding in on itself as I trailed the cat deeper into the woods. Finally, we reached a clearing. In the center stood a tree unlike any I'd ever seen. Its bark was blackened and smooth, and its branches twisted upward into sharp, jagged shapes that seemed to claw at the sky. The ground around its base was bare, the soil pale and dry, as though nothing had grown there for centuries. The cat stopped at the edge of the clearing and sat down, its yellow eyes fixed on the tree. I stepped closer. The air was heavier here, thicker, as though the tree was pulling something from the space around it. The closer I got, the louder the silence became, pressing against my ears like a scream just out of reach. My breath felt shallow, my chest tight. And then I saw them. Faces. They were faint, almost imperceptible at first, but as I squinted, they became clearer. Dozens of faces, carved into the bark, their features frozen in expressions of fear and anguish. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, and for a moment, I swore I heard whispers threading through the stillness, soft and pleading. I turned to leave, but the path was gone. The woods were different now, darker, the trees shifting subtly in the dim light. The cat was still sitting at the edge of the clearing, its gaze fixed on me, unblinking. I took a step toward it, and the whispers grew louder. The ground beneath my feet gave way. I fell, the air rushing past me in a blur of shadows and cold. When I landed, it wasn't on soil but something smooth and solid, like polished stone. I was in a vast, endless space, the air thick with the scent of decay. In the distance, I could see the tree, its branches stretching impossibly far, piercing the sky like needles. The cat was there, too, though now it was larger, its sleek black fur rippling like smoke. Its eyes glowed brighter, and its voice filled the space around me. Not words, exactly, but a low, resonant hum that burrowed into my thoughts. I wasn't alone. Shapes emerged from the shadows, tall and thin, their forms shifting and indistinct. They moved slowly, circling me, their hollow eyes fixed on mine. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to back away, but the ground beneath me rippled, holding me in place. The cat stepped forward, its movements liquid and deliberate. It stopped just in front of me, tilting its head as though studying me one last time. "You opened the door," the voice said, though I couldn't tell if it came from the cat or the space around us. The shapes closed in, their faces featureless, their movements synchronized. I don't remember what happened next. I woke in my bed, the first light of dawn streaming through the window. The cat was gone, as was the strange clearing and the impossible tree. For a moment, I convinced myself it had been a dream. But when I stepped outside, I saw it. A single blackened branch lying on my porch, its surface smooth as glass, its edges sharp as razors. And in the distance, I swear I can still hear the whispers. The night my father disappeared, he left the front door wide open. We lived in a house tucked against a stretch of woods so thick it felt like the edge of the world. It was the kind of place where cell service barely existed and where, after sunset, the only light came from the weak yellow glow of our porch bulb. My father, a quiet man with a taste for solitude, had chosen the place after my mother left us. "It's good to be away from the noise," he'd always said. I think he meant people. That night, I had been in my room, reading. The wind was fierce, rattling the windows, and I barely noticed the sound of the front door creaking open. When I finally stepped out into the hallway, I saw it, ajar, swinging gently, the lock dangling uselessly. The cold was spilling in, curling around my ankles. "Dad?" No answer. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and stepped outside, squinting into the dense darkness beyond the porch. The woods loomed, black and impenetrable. I didn't see his truck, didn't hear his voice, just the wind, howling through the trees like something alive. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I called the sheriff. A search party combed the area for days. They found nothing. No footprints. No signs of struggle. Not even his truck, which should have been parked out front. Just the door, still ajar, as though he'd been lured into the night by something unseen. Weeks passed, then months. The search was called off. The calls from well-meaning neighbors stopped, and the world moved on. But I stayed in the house, partly out of guilt, partly because it felt like leaving would be admitting he was gone for good. And then, 6 months to the day after his disappearance, the knocking started. It was late, well past midnight. I had just climbed into bed when I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. I froze, my mind racing. No one ever came out here, not this far. I grabbed the flashlight again, the beam trembling slightly as I made my way down the hall. The door was closed this time, the lock in place, but the knocking continued, steady and patient. When I reached the door, I hesitated. "Who's there?" No response. I swallowed hard, my hand hovering over the lock. The flashlight beam flickered. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, thick and suffocating. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard something else, a faint scratching, like nails dragging against wood. It started at the base of the door and climbed upward, slow and deliberate, until it reached the top. My breath hitched. I didn't open the door. The next morning, I found the scratches. Deep, jagged grooves ran the length of the door, cutting into the wood like a warning. That day, I bought new locks, reinforced the windows, kept a knife under my pillow. But the knocking came again the next night, and the next. It always came at the same time. 3 precise knocks, followed by that relentless scratching. I tried calling the sheriff again, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing to see. The wood swallowed evidence the way it swallowed sound. By the 3rd week, I was barely sleeping. I started to dread nightfall, the slow creep of shadows across the floor. And every time I heard that knocking, a question burrowed deeper into my mind. What would happen if I opened the door? On the 22nd night, I found out. The knocking came later than usual, closer to 2 a.m. I had been sitting in the dark, clutching the flashlight, when the sound echoed through the house. This time, there was something different about it. Less measured, more insistent. It felt angry. The flashlight flickered again, and the room seemed to contract, the air heavy with something I couldn't name. My chest tightened. I stood, my legs shaky, and made my way to the door. The scratching began before I reached it, louder than ever, almost frantic. My hand hovered over the lock, trembling. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The scratching stopped, and then, a voice, low, guttural, and impossibly familiar. "Let me in." It was my father's voice. My breath caught. I staggered back, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. It couldn't be him. It couldn't be. "Dad, let me in," the voice repeated, closer now. Something slammed against the door, hard enough to rattle the frame. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. The voice came again, louder, more insistent. "Let me in." The door shook, the hinges groaning under the strain. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor and plunging the room into darkness. I don't remember screaming, but my throat was raw the next morning. When I woke, the door was still intact, though the scratches were deeper than ever. I left the house that day, packed a bag, and drove until the woods were a distant memory. I've tried to convince myself it was a dream, some fevered hallucination brought on by grief and exhaustion. But every so often, I hear it again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, echoing in my mind like a song I can't forget. And somewhere, in the shadows of the trees, something is waiting for me to open the door. The first postcard arrived on an unremarkable Wednesday, tucked between a utility bill and a coupon flyer. At first glance, it was nothing special, just an image of a foggy forest, the kind you'd find on the cover of a generic paperback thriller. On the back, in handwriting so small and precise it felt mechanical, were 4 words. "You were almost there." I turned the card over in my hands, confused. There was no return address, no signature, nothing that could hint at who sent it. I even checked the postmark, but it was smeared beyond recognition. Probably a prank, I thought, tossing it onto the kitchen counter. But I couldn't quite shake the feeling it left behind. The second postcard came 2 days later. This one showed a lighthouse on the edge of a jagged cliff, waves crashing below. The image was stark and lonely, the kind of place that felt heavy with silence. The message on the back read, "You passed it last night." That was the moment I realized it wasn't random. I had driven past a lighthouse the night before, coming home from a late dinner with a friend. I didn't stop or even slow down, but it had been there, exactly as the postcard described. I stared at the card for a long time, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't told anyone about the drive, and there was no way a stranger could have known where I'd been. Still, I convinced myself it was a coincidence. Maybe it was part of some guerrilla marketing campaign. Maybe someone had spotted my car and decided to mess with me. The possibilities were strange, but not impossible. By the time the third postcard arrived, I wasn't so sure. This one depicted a dilapidated wooden bridge stretching across a dark, misty river. The handwriting on the back was the same, but this time the message was longer. "You didn't stop. Why didn't you stop?" I had seen that bridge, too. A week ago, during a hike on a secluded trail, I'd paused just long enough to snap a picture before turning back. Something about the scene had felt wrong, too quiet, too still, but I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, the cards were stacking up on my kitchen counter, each one more unnerving than the last. I searched every corner of my life for answers. I asked my friends, scoured social media, even drove back to the post office to ask about the smudged postmarks. No one had any answers. And then came the fourth card. This one didn't depict a place I recognized. It showed a house, weathered, leaning slightly to one side, its windows dark and empty. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the roof sagged under the weight of years. On the back, the message was chillingly direct. "Come inside." I flipped the card over and over, my hands trembling. Something about the image felt alive, as if the house were watching me through its vacant windows. My instinct was to throw it away, to banish it from my home like a cursed object, but I didn't. Instead, I tucked it into the drawer with the others, where it sat like a bomb waiting to detonate. The dreams began that night. I was standing in front of the house from the postcard, the same weeds brushing against my ankles. The air was thick, almost liquid, and I couldn't breathe without effort. The front door swung open slowly, creaking on its hinges, and a figure stood just inside. I couldn't see its face, only the outline of a body framed in shadow. "Come in," it said, though its voice sounded like it came from all around me. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The next morning, there was another postcard waiting for me. This one wasn't in my mailbox. It was on the floor, just inside my front door, as if someone had slipped it through in the middle of the night. The image was familiar, too familiar. It was my street, my apartment building. The view was taken from the corner, as though someone had stood there and carefully framed the shot. The message read, "We're almost ready." I didn't go to work that day. I didn't go anywhere. I stayed locked inside my apartment, staring at the postcards laid out in a line on the coffee table. They felt like pieces of a puzzle, but the picture they formed was one I didn't want to see. By the time night fell, I was exhausted but too scared to sleep. The silence of the apartment felt suffocating, and every creak of the building made me flinch. Just before midnight, I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate tap, like someone testing the wood. I froze. My phone was on the table, but I didn't reach for it. Something told me that no one could help me now. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I crept toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest, and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, and then the door opened. It didn't swing wide, just enough to reveal the edge of the darkened hallway beyond. The air felt colder, sharper, and I realized I was holding my breath. A hand reached through the gap. It was pale, almost translucent, the fingers long and unnaturally thin. They brushed against the frame of the door, lingering there, as though waiting for me to take them. When I didn't move, the voice came again. "Come in." The hand withdrew, and the door closed with a quiet click. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke the next morning, there was one final postcard. It wasn't on the floor this time. It was in my hand. The image showed me, sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by the other postcards, staring blankly ahead. The message on the back read, "You're already here." The postcards are gone now. So is my apartment. I don't know where I am or how I got here, but the house from the fourth card is outside my window. The door is open, and this time, I think I'll go in. The stars went out one by one. I didn't notice at first. People don't look up enough, and I was no different. Life on Earth is loud, messy, and full of distractions. So when the faintest pinpricks of light began vanishing from the night sky, no one said anything. Or if they did, I didn't hear them. The first time I realized something was wrong, I was hiking in Red Rock Canyon. I always went alone. It was my version of therapy. And that evening the trail was deserted. save for the endless expanse of sandstone and the sinking sun. Twilight was creeping in when I stopped to rest. The desert stretched around me in every direction, vast and untamed. The first stars began to appear, faint and fragile against the deepening indigo. I leaned back against the rock, content, until I saw it. A patch of the sky, small but distinct, was empty. No stars, no satellites, no faint glimmers of distant galaxies. Just darkness, sharper and blacker than the rest of the night. It was like a hole had been punched through the fabric of the cosmos. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. I told myself it was clouds, or dust, or something atmospheric I didn't understand. But clouds don't hold their shape that perfectly, and dust doesn't block out light with such precision. I didn't tell anyone when I got back. Over the next few weeks, I started paying more attention to the sky. The patch of darkness grew larger, eating away at constellations one by one. Orion lost his belt first, then his bow. The Big Dipper turned into a faint, broken ladle, its stars winking out like dying candles. No one else seemed to notice. I'd scroll through social media and news headlines, desperate for some confirmation that this was real, that I wasn't imagining it. Nothing. Just the usual chaos of the human world. Wars, politics, celebrity gossip. One night, I took my camera out into the desert. I had to see if the lens would catch what my eyes couldn't. The patch was even bigger now, spreading like ink spilled on parchment. When I aimed the camera and zoomed in, the darkness resolved into something worse. It wasn't empty. It was full. I don't know how to describe it without sounding insane. There were shapes in the blackness, massive and unknowable, their edges just barely visible against the void. They moved, slow and deliberate, as though they were aware of my gaze. I dropped the camera and stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't go out again after that. The world didn't change much, at least not at first. The city lights still buzzed, people still argued in grocery store aisles, and car horns still blared on crowded streets. But at night, the sky grew darker. The darkness crept inward, swallowing the stars until only the brightest ones remained, scattered and defiant. One evening, just after sunset, my neighbor knocked on my door. She was holding a folded piece of paper, her hands trembling slightly. "Did you get one of these?" she asked. I unfolded the paper. It was blank except for a single sentence printed in the center. "Prepare to be seen." I stared at her, searching for some hint of a joke, but her expression was grim. "I thought it was spam," she said, but then I looked outside. She didn't need to say more. I followed her to her backyard, where the horizon was already fading into night. The stars were gone, not just the faint ones, everything. The sky was black from edge to edge, an abyss so complete it made my chest tighten, and in the void, the shapes moved closer. They were larger now, impossibly large, their forms defying comprehension. They twisted and shifted, their edges folding into themselves in ways that made my eyes ache. And they were watching. I felt it before I saw it. A pressure, faint but growing, as though the weight of their attention had turned its focus to me. My neighbor let out a choked gasp, and when I turned to look at her, her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "They're listening," she whispered. I didn't ask her how she knew. I felt it too. That night, the world changed. The shapes descended, not quickly, not with the chaos of invasion, but with a slow inevitability that was far worse. They moved like glaciers, silent and unstoppable, their forms blotting out the horizon. There were no broadcasts, no emergency alerts. Phones and televisions went dark. The streets emptied, not because anyone told us to leave, but because everyone knew. Somewhere deep in our bones, in the primal parts of us that remember being prey, we knew. I stayed in my apartment, curtains drawn, lights off. The paper my neighbor had given me sat on the counter. Its message burned into my mind. Prepare to be seen. At some point, I realized the silence wasn't complete. There was a hum, low and constant, vibrating through the walls and the floor. It wasn't mechanical, not quite, but it carried a rhythm, almost like breathing. When I finally gathered the courage to look outside, the sky was filled with them. The shapes. They were so close now that I could see their surfaces, rippling like water, shifting like smoke. They moved with purpose, their forms brushing against the tops of skyscrapers, bending but never breaking. They didn't touch the ground. They didn't need to. I don't know what they wanted. They never spoke, never made demands, never gave us a reason for their presence. They just watched, and we watched back. Some people fled to the countryside, but the shapes followed. Others gathered in parks and open spaces, staring up in awe and terror, hoping for answers that never came. For weeks, the world held its breath. Then, one by one, the shapes began to leave. Not all of them. Some remained, drifting like clouds, their edges dimming but never disappearing. The stars didn't come back, and the night stayed black. But life went on. People returned to their routines, though nothing felt routine anymore. As for me, I stopped looking up. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I feel the pressure again, faint but unmistakable. And I know they're still there, watching, waiting. For what? I don't think I'll ever know. The house on Magnolia Street wasn't abandoned, but it should have been. It stood at the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown hedges and a rusting iron fence. The windows were blacked out, not from grime but from curtains drawn tight against the world. You could walk by every day for a year and never see a soul coming or going. I knew the stories. Everyone in town did. A reclusive old man had lived there for decades, they said, but no one had seen him in years. Some whispered that he'd died and that the house was waiting for someone to find his body. Others claimed he was still inside, watching, waiting. I didn't believe any of it. At least, not at first. The night I stepped onto the porch, the air felt heavy, like the atmosphere thickened the closer I got to the front door. My flashlight flickered, but I chalked it up to the cheap batteries I'd grabbed from the gas station. It wasn't my idea to come here. This was Maddie's thing. She loved scaring herself stupid with haunted house stories and urban legends, and she had dragged me and Jake along for what she called a little urban exploration. Maddie was fearless. She shoved open the creaky gate and strode up the path like she owned the place. Jake followed, more hesitant, but with the kind of bravado that only came from not wanting to look like a coward in front of a girl. I was the last one to step through the gate, already regretting my life choices. The door wasn't locked. Maddie tried the handle, and it opened with a groan that echoed into the dark interior. She laughed, turning to us with a grin that didn't reach her eyes. "See? Nothing to worry about," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. Inside, the house was cold. Not just chilly, but the kind of cold that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. The air smelled faintly metallic, like old pennies, and the wooden floors were warped and uneven beneath our feet. Maddie's flashlight swept over peeling wallpaper and faded portraits of people long dead. "Creepy, but not haunted," Jake said, though he stayed close to the door. We explored cautiously, stepping around broken furniture and avoiding the places where the floors sagged dangerously. Maddie found a staircase and insisted we go up, her curiosity outweighing her sense of self-preservation. The second floor was worse. The air felt heavier up there, like it had been waiting for us. Dust motes floated in the beam of Maddie's flashlight, and every sound we made seemed magnified, like the house was listening. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. That's the only way I can describe it. At first, it seemed normal, 4 doors on either side, leading to bedrooms or storage. But as we walked, the hallway kept going. The light from Maddie's flashlight seemed to stretch too far, as if it was illuminating more space than it should have. Jake noticed it first. "Guys," he whispered, his voice low and tight, "have we passed that mirror before?" I looked where he was pointing. A tarnished mirror hung on the wall, its frame cracked and coated in dust. It felt familiar, though I couldn't say why. Maddie hesitated for the first time, her flashlight shaking slightly. "We probably just missed it," she said, but her confidence was starting to crack. We kept walking. The mirror came again, and again. Each time, it looked the same, tarnished, cracked, dust-covered. But the reflection was wrong. It wasn't us. The first time I noticed, I thought it was a trick of the light. But as we passed the mirror for the 3rd or 4th time, I realized the figures in the glass didn't match our movements. They were slower, delayed, like they were lagging behind us. Jake saw it too. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. "What the hell is this?" he hissed. "I don't know," I whispered back, my voice shaking. Maddie didn't respond. Her flashlight had gone out, and she was fumbling with the buttons, her breathing shallow. "Guys, let's just go back," I said, turning toward the direction we'd come. Except it wasn't the same. The hallway behind us was dark, stretching endlessly into nothing. The door we'd entered from was gone. "Where's the exit?" Jake's voice cracked. "I don't know." Maddie's panic was palpable now. We turned back toward the mirror, but this time, there was only one reflection. Mine. Maddie and Jake weren't there. The figure in the glass moved, but I hadn't. Its head tilted slowly to the side, its mouth curling into a smile that didn't belong to me. "Run," it whispered. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed Maddie and Jake, dragging them toward the nearest door. We stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. The room was small, empty except for a single chair in the center. The walls were lined with the same faded wallpaper, but something about it felt alive. The patterns writhed faintly, like they were breathing. "We need to get out of here," Maddie said, her voice trembling. "There's no out," a voice said, low and melodic. It didn't come from the chair. It came from everywhere at once. The walls pulsed, and the room seemed to shrink around us. Maddie screamed, and Jake grabbed the doorknob, yanking it open. Except it wasn't a hallway on the other side. It was the mirror, and in the reflection, we weren't standing still. We were running, sprinting down a hallway that didn't exist, our faces twisted in terror. The voice came again, closer now. "You're already inside." The last thing I remember is the mirror shattering, shards of glass flying everywhere. But instead of seeing my reflection in the pieces, I saw nothing, just darkness. I woke up outside, lying on the overgrown grass of the front yard. The house was gone. Maddie and Jake were gone. And when I looked at my hands, they weren't mine anymore. There was a small, antique bookstore on the corner of Orchard and Ninth, nestled between a pawn shop and a shuttered diner. I'd walked past it 100 times, but never gone in. Something about its dim windows and the faded sign that read Craven's Curiosities felt uninviting, like the kind of place you didn't enter unless it called to you. That night, it did. The rain had been relentless all evening, driving me to seek shelter. I stepped inside without much thought, the bell above the door jangling like an afterthought. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and something faintly metallic. It was warmer than I expected, the kind of warmth that seems to come from nowhere, soaking into your skin. The shop was cluttered but organized, its shelves overflowing with books that ranged from the mundane to the esoteric. Behind the counter sat a man who seemed to blend into the shadows, his long, thin fingers tracing the spine of a book. He glanced up when I entered, his face pale but strangely forgettable. "Welcome," he said, his voice as soft as the rustling pages around him. "Looking for anything specific?" I shook my head, brushing rain from my coat. "Just browsing." He nodded and returned to his book, leaving me to explore. The aisles felt tighter than they should have been, the shelves looming overhead as if they were closing in. I wandered aimlessly until something caught my eye. A book lying open on a small, wooden table in the back. It wasn't the title that drew me in, The Other Histories, but the illustration on the page. It showed a faceless figure standing in the middle of a crowd, its head tilted slightly, as if observing the people around it. They didn't seem to notice it was there. The caption beneath the image read, "The Unnamed One, Keeper of Shadows, Watcher of Secrets." I should have walked away, but instead, I reached out and touched the page. The lights flickered. The hum of the shop's heater grew louder, almost drowning out the sound of rain hitting the windows. I pulled my hand back, startled, but the shopkeeper's voice broke the moment. "Interesting choice," he said, suddenly beside me. I hadn't heard him approach. "Not many people are drawn to that one." "It's strange," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of his lips. "Strange things find their way to those who need them." Before I could respond, he gently closed the book and handed it to me. "Take it," he said. "No charge." I wanted to protest, but the words stuck in my throat. His eyes were fixed on mine, pale and unblinking. I nodded, tucked the book under my arm, and left without another word. The rain followed me home, pounding against the windows of my apartment as I set the book on the kitchen table. I told myself I'd made a mistake going in there, that I should return it first thing in the morning. But curiosity got the better of me. I flipped through the pages, each one filled with stories of strange, forgotten beings, entities that existed on the edges of perception. The illustrations were unsettling. Each figure seemed to watch me as I turned the pages, their faceless forms rendered in intricate, almost lifelike detail. One in particular made me pause. A tall, spindly creature standing in a darkened room, its fingers pressed against a frosted window. The caption read, "Once invited, it cannot be unmade." I slammed the book shut and shoved it into a drawer, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. That night, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was the rain, but as I sat up, I realized it was coming from inside the apartment. A soft, deliberate tapping, like fingernails on glass. My heart raced as I crept toward the source of the noise. My living room window. The blinds swayed gently, though the window was closed. The tapping stopped as I reached for the cord, hesitating for a moment before pulling it. Nothing, just the empty street below, slick with rain. I let out a shaky breath, convincing myself it had been a branch or the wind. But as I turned to go back to bed, I froze. The book was on the coffee table. I knew I'd left it in the drawer. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the pages falling open to the illustration of the figure by the frosted window. The caption was gone, replaced by a single word, scrawled in jagged handwriting, "Welcome." The days that followed blurred together, a haze of sleepless nights and strange occurrences. The tapping returned every evening, always at the same time. Doors I was certain I'd closed would creak open behind me. My reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed to linger a fraction too long when I turned away. And then there were the shadows. They moved when they shouldn't have, stretching across the walls in ways that defied the light. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd see something tall and thin, standing just beyond the edge of my vision, always watching, always waiting. I went back to the shop, desperate for answers. But when I reached the corner of Orchard and Ninth, it was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. A woman passing by noticed my confusion. "Looking for something?" she asked. "There was a bookstore here," I said. "Craven's Curiosities." She frowned. "There hasn't been a store there in years. Burned down in the 80s. I stared at her, uncomprehending. "That's not possible. I was just there last week." She gave me a strange look before walking away. I never found the shop again. The book remains in my apartment, no matter how many times I try to get rid of it. I've burned it, buried it, thrown it into the river, but it always returns, waiting for me on the kitchen table, open to a different page each time. The tapping hasn't stopped, neither have the shadows. And every night, when I finally close my eyes, I dream of the faceless figure standing at the edge of my bed, its head tilted as it watches me. I don't think I'll ever finish my novel. Some stories don't belong to us. Some stories belong to something else. And sometimes they come looking for you. The ceiling light in my office buzzed faintly, a sound I'd learned to tune out after years of working late. It was after midnight, and the only other light came from the glow of my monitor, its harsh blue casting long shadows across the desk. I was sifting through emails, trying to ignore the yawning fatigue clawing at my mind, when I noticed something odd. The cursor moved. Not much, just a slight nudge to the left, barely perceptible, like someone had brushed the mouse. I froze, my fingers hovering above the keyboard. Maybe it was a glitch, I thought. Or maybe I'd nudged the desk without realizing it. I reached for the mouse to reposition it, but before I could touch it, the cursor moved again. This time, it dragged itself to the top corner of the screen and stopped, hovering there like it was waiting for something. I pulled my hand back, a strange unease settling in my chest. The air in the room felt heavier now, charged with a tension I couldn't name. My reflection in the darkened monitor caught my eye, and for a moment, I thought something was wrong with it. My face looked pale, my expression strained, as though I wasn't just tired but scared. The cursor jerked suddenly, racing across the screen in erratic zigzags. My heart hammered as I yanked the power cord from the monitor. The screen went dark, but I didn't feel relief. The buzzing overhead had grown louder, a persistent hum that seemed to resonate in my teeth. I glanced at the door to the office, half tempted to leave and pretend none of this was happening, but something stopped me. It wasn't courage or curiosity. It was the sound. A knock. Not on the door, but on the window behind me. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to keep my eyes forward, to stay at my desk and ignore whatever was there. But my head turned anyway, as though compelled by something stronger than fear. The blinds were closed, but the knock came again, deliberate and slow, like whoever, or whatever. It was wanted to be sure I heard it. The room felt colder now, a sharp, biting chill that seeped into my bones. With trembling hands, I reached for the cord and raised the blinds. The window was empty, just the dark city skyline beyond, the faint glimmer of distant streetlights, and nothing else. But the knocking didn't stop. It wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from the other side of the glass. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over my chair, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out the buzzing light. There was no one there, no shadow, no face pressed against the glass. Just that steady knock, as though the empty air itself was trying to get in. The monitor flickered back to life, though I hadn't plugged it in. The screen was black, but not blank. Words appeared, scrawled in sharp, uneven letters. "You left the door open." I turned toward the office door, my pulse racing. It was closed. I was certain of it. I had locked it when I came in. The words on the screen shifted, rearranging themselves like pieces of a puzzle. Not that door. The knock behind me stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was an oppressive void, a kind of stillness that pressed against my ears and chest, making it hard to breathe. Then I heard the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. It came from just behind me. I didn't look. I couldn't. My legs felt like lead, my hands clammy and useless at my sides. I stared at the monitor, hoping for some clue, some explanation. The words had vanished, replaced by a live feed of the office. From a corner I couldn't see. On the screen, my chair was empty. The desk was lit by the dim glow of the monitor, but the shadows around it seemed to pulse, stretching and shifting as though alive. In one of those shadows, something moved. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could recognize. The shape was tall and angular, its outline fractured like a shattered mirror held together by invisible threads. It moved closer to the desk on the screen, the broken geometry of its limbs bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. On the screen, the shadow thing stopped moving. It was standing where I should have been sitting, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Then, slowly, it turned to face the camera. It had no face, but somehow, I knew it was looking at me. I bolted for the door, my hands fumbling with the lock. The buzzing overhead grew deafening, drowning out every thought, every instinct except the one telling me to run. The door swung open, and I stumbled into the hallway, my breath shallow and ragged. The corridor stretched out endlessly in both directions. That wasn't possible. The office building had 3 floors. I'd walked this hall every day for years, and it always ended in a stairwell just a few steps away. Now it seemed to stretch forever, the lights overhead flickering erratically. Behind me, the door slammed shut. I didn't wait to see if it would open again. I ran, my footsteps echoing in the endless hallway, the air growing colder with every step. The lights began to go out, one by one, the darkness chasing me. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape it. The sound of scraping followed me, steady and relentless. And I knew without looking that the thing from the office was still there. The last light ahead flickered. The floor beneath me vanished, and I fell. When I woke, I was back at my desk. The office was quiet, the monitor dark, the blinds drawn. My phone buzzed beside me, its screen displaying a notification. Missed call, unknown. I stared at the phone, then at the clock on the wall. It was 7:38 a.m. The cursor on the screen moved, and somewhere, faint and deliberate, I heard the knock again. The first time I noticed the blank spot in my memory, I dismissed it as nothing. It was a Thursday morning, and I was at the grocery store, standing in the canned goods aisle with my cart half full. I blinked, and suddenly I was outside in the parking lot, my arms laden with bags. No receipt in my hand. No memory of checking out. I stared down at the bags, then back at the automatic doors, trying to piece together the gap. Maybe I was distracted, I told myself. Maybe I'd gone through the motions without realizing it. It wasn't like I'd blacked out or anything. But as I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, I noticed my hands were trembling. That night, I dreamed of a place I didn't recognize. A vast, windowless room, its walls smooth and featureless, stretching endlessly in every direction. The air was heavy, humming faintly, like the sound of fluorescent lights. I wandered through the emptiness, my footsteps echoing against the nothingness, until I saw it. A figure stood in the distance, its outline barely visible against the gray. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me with eyes I couldn't see but felt all the same. When I woke, my heart was pounding, my sheets damp with sweat. The next few days passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me. The dream stayed lodged in my mind like a splinter, and I found myself scanning crowds for familiar strangers or stopping mid-conversation, convinced I'd forgotten something important. It wasn't until the second gap that I realized something was truly wrong. I was at work, sitting at my desk, typing up an email. The clock read 2:14 p.m. I blinked, and the next thing I knew, the office was empty. The lights had dimmed, the faint hum of computers replaced by the sterile quiet of after hours. My screen was blank, and the clock read 8:37 p.m. I stood up too quickly, my chair scraping against the floor. The panic came in waves. My boss would be furious. My coworkers would think I'd disappeared. But when I checked my inbox, there were no angry emails, no missed calls. The draft I'd been working on was gone, but the message had been sent. The timestamp was 2:20 p.m. I stared at it, my hands gripping the edge of the desk to keep from shaking. I didn't remember finishing the email. I didn't remember anything. I told myself it had to be stress, lack of sleep, too much caffeine. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The dreams came more frequently after that. Always the same empty room, the same oppressive hum. The figure grew closer each time, though I never saw it move. By the third dream, I could make out its face, or rather, the absence of one. It was me, not an exact copy, but close enough to be unsettling. The features were blurred, like a painting smeared by rain, but the shape of it, my shape, was unmistakable. It tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, and I woke up gasping, my throat raw from a scream I didn't remember making. I stopped sleeping after that. The third gap happened in broad daylight. I was walking home from the bus stop, the sun warm on my back, when I felt it, a subtle shift, like stepping into a room where the air pressure is wrong. For a split second, the world around me seemed to flicker, the colors bleeding into each other like wet paint. And then I was home. I was sitting on my couch, my shoes neatly placed by the door, my coat draped over the armrest. The clock on the wall said 7:03 p.m. My bus ride should have taken 15 minutes. I checked my phone. The last text I'd sent was at 5:22 p.m. I didn't remember sending it. I tried to tell someone. My friend Elena was the only person I trusted enough to confide in. But as I explained the gaps, the flickering, the dreams, her face shifted from concern to something colder. "You've been acting strange lately," she said carefully. "Strange how?" Her hesitation made my stomach drop. "You'll say things and then forget them. You'll text me, but when I reply, you don't seem to know what I'm talking about." She rubbed the back of her neck, avoiding my gaze. "The other day, you called me and didn't say anything for 5 minutes. Just breathing." I hadn't called her in weeks. I left her apartment feeling more alone than ever. The next dream wasn't in the featureless room. This time, I was in my apartment, but something was wrong. The walls were too bare, the furniture arranged in ways I would never arrange them. I moved through the space, my footsteps soundless, my reflection absent from every mirror. I found myself standing in front of my bedroom door. I didn't remember walking there, but the door was open now, the darkness inside yawning and endless. I stepped in, and there I was again. The figure, my reflection, or whatever it was, standing in the center of the room. Its head tilted, its posture casual, like it had been waiting. "Who are you?" I asked, though my voice came out as a whisper. It smiled, and that was worse than the silence. "I'm the real one." I woke to find my phone in my hand, a message typed out but unsent. "Please help me. I don't think I'm real anymore." The gaps are longer now. Entire days vanish without explanation. My memories feel slippery, like trying to hold water in my hands. People act strangely around me, their smiles too tight, their conversations stilted. I don't dream anymore, and the reflection in my mirror doesn't always follow my movements. The letter arrived in the mail with no return address. It was nestled among the usual pile of bills and junk, unremarkable at first glance. The envelope was plain white, the kind you'd pick up in bulk at the store, but the paper was thick, almost waxy to the touch. My name and address were scrawled across it in black ink, written with a heavy hand that left indentations on the surface. I opened it at the kitchen counter, more out of curiosity than expectation. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. There was no greeting, no signature, just a short message written in the same dense handwriting. "There's something in the basement." I stared at it for a long moment, feeling an odd chill settle into my chest. My house didn't have a basement. At first, I thought it was a prank. I'd only moved into this house 2 months ago, and I didn't know anyone well enough for them to send something like this as a joke. Still, it was easier to believe that than to dwell on the faint edge of unease the letter stirred in me. I tossed it in the trash and went about my evening, trying not to think about it. That night, I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a faint, irregular tapping coming from somewhere below the floorboards. I told myself it was the house settling. Old pipes, maybe. The kind of noises you expect in a place like this. But it didn't stop. Every few minutes, the tapping would start up again. 3 soft, deliberate knocks, followed by silence. By the time morning came, I'd convinced myself it was nothing worth worrying about. A loose board or a rodent, at worst. I grabbed a flashlight and crawled under the house, checking every inch of the space. It was empty, dusty and full of cobwebs, but empty. I didn't hear the tapping again for the rest of the day. But the next morning, there was another letter waiting for me. This one was folded differently, its edges sharper, as though whoever had written it had been in a hurry. The message inside was just as brief. "You didn't look closely enough." I felt the unease return, sharper now, digging into the edges of my thoughts. The trash can still held the first letter, crumpled but intact. Seeing the two together made the situation feel intentional. I didn't go back under the house that day. Instead, I called the realtor who'd sold me the place. I asked if the property had any unusual features or history I should know about. He laughed, the kind of easy laugh people use to fill awkward silences. "Not that I'm aware of," he said. "But hey, old houses, right? They've got their quirks." The conversation left me feeling hollow. That night, the tapping came back. Louder this time. Closer. It seemed to follow me from room to room, always just below my feet. I pressed my ear to the floor, trying to pinpoint the source, but it was as though the sound was coming from everywhere at once. At one point, I swear I heard a voice. Faint, muffled, and impossible to understand, but undeniably there. I didn't sleep. The third letter arrived the next day. "The door is there. You just have to find it." I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. There was no basement. I'd walked through every inch of the house before buying it. I'd seen the blueprints. There was no door. But as I stood in the living room, clutching the letter in my shaking hands, I felt it. The faintest draft, cold and sharp, brushing against the back of my neck. It came from nowhere. And yet, when I turned, it felt like the room was subtly wrong. I don't know how to explain it. The walls looked the same, the furniture untouched, but the space felt distorted, like a photo stretched just enough to feel unnatural. That night, the tapping changed. It wasn't beneath the floor anymore. It was in the walls. I couldn't take it. Armed with a crowbar and a surge of adrenaline, I pried away a section of paneling in the hallway. Dust billowed out, coating the air in a fine, choking mist. Behind the wall was a door. It was small, barely 5 feet tall, its wood dark and weathered. A rusted handle protruded from its center, surrounded by deep gouges, as though someone had tried, and failed, to claw their way inside. I didn't open it. I couldn't. Instead, I replaced the paneling and left the house, spending the night in a cheap motel on the other side of town. The letters followed me. The next one was slipped under my motel door. "You're running out of time." I didn't go back to the house. Not for weeks. I called contractors, inspectors, anyone who might have answers, but they all said the same thing. No basement. No hidden rooms. No reason for a door to exist. But the letters didn't stop. Every morning, wherever I was staying, there would be another one waiting for me. It's waiting for you. It can't be ignored. You let it in. I don't know how they keep finding me. Last night, I woke up to find the tapping inside the motel room. The walls, the floor, even the headboard of the bed. It was everywhere. And when I looked in the bathroom mirror, I saw it. The door. It was behind me, just as it had been in the house, dark and unyielding. The gouges around the handle deeper now. I turned, but there was nothing there. This morning, I received what I think will be the last letter. It was written on the back of one of the previous notes, the ink bleeding through the paper. "Open the door, or it will open itself." I think I know what it means now. The door isn't in the house. It never was. It's here, in me, growing closer every day. And I don't know if I'll be able to stop it when it finally opens. The attic had always been a place of avoidance. Dust-heavy air, slanted beams casting strange shadows, boxes stacked precariously like forgotten monuments to a life before. When Marin climbed the narrow staircase that afternoon, it wasn't curiosity that drove her, but the need for escape. The argument with her sister had left her breathless, the kind of fight where words sting long after they're spoken. Up here, among the discarded remnants of their family's history, it felt easier to breathe. The window was small, but it let in enough light to illuminate the motes swirling lazily in the air. Marin's eyes fell on an old trunk in the corner, its surface covered in an uneven layer of grime. It was the kind of thing you'd expect to find in an attic, a relic of someone else's past. The brass latches were tarnished, and the lid sat slightly askew, as if waiting for someone to notice. She hesitated. The argument still throbbed in her chest, and part of her wanted to leave the trunk alone, to keep its secrets intact. But something about it called to her, a silent invitation she couldn't ignore. She knelt in front of it, her fingers brushing the cool metal latch, and lifted the lid. Inside was a mirror. It wasn't large, barely bigger than a hardcover book. Its frame made of dark wood intricately carved with shapes that seemed to shift under her gaze. The glass itself was cloudy, like it had been tarnished by time. But her reflection stared back clearly, too clearly. She picked it up, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame, and the air seemed to shift around her. The attic grew quieter, the stillness pressing against her ears until even her breathing sounded distant. Marin tilted the mirror, trying to catch the faint light from the window, and something moved. Not her reflection, something behind her. She spun around, the mirror clutched tightly in her hands, but the attic was empty, only shadows and silence. When she looked back at the mirror, her reflection was gone. Her breath caught in her throat. The glass now showed the attic as it was, the boxes, the beams, the pale light filtering through the window, but she wasn't in it. Instead, there was something else. A figure, faint at first, standing where she had been just seconds ago. Its shape was wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. The edges of its form flickered, like a candle struggling to stay lit. She wanted to drop the mirror, to let it shatter and be done with whatever nightmare she had stumbled into, but her hands wouldn't move. The figure began to step forward, its movements jerky, like it was learning how to walk. It reached the edge of the frame and stopped, tilting its head as if studying her. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, its hand pressed against the glass, pale and blurred, but solid enough to leave faint marks like frost on a window pane. The mirror grew heavier in her hands, the weight pulling her forward, and the attic seemed to darken around her. Then it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It was layered, fragmented, like dozens of whispers trying to find the same rhythm. "Let me in." Marin shook her head, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I don't know what you are," she managed, "but I'm not letting you in." The figure tilted its head again, the movement sharp and unnatural. The frost-like marks on the glass spread, curling into spirals and shapes that mirrored the carvings on the frame. The attic around her felt smaller, the walls pressing closer, the light fading as if the sun had been snuffed out. "You already have," the voice said. The mirror grew cold in her hands, the chill spreading through her arms and into her chest. The figure began to push harder against the glass, its form distorting, the surface rippling like water. Marin's breath came in short, panicked bursts as she fought to hold on, to keep whatever it was from breaking through. The carvings on the frame glowed faintly now, their shapes pulsing with a rhythm that didn't belong to this world. "Stop," she said, her voice cracking. "Go back." The attic was gone. She stood in a void. The floor beneath her feet a faint shimmer of light that didn't seem to come from anywhere. The mirror was still in her hands, but the figure was gone. In its place was something worse, a reflection of herself, but not her. The eyes were too dark, the expression too calm, as if this version of her knew things she didn't. The reflection smiled. "You shouldn't have opened the trunk," it said. Marin tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. The mirror began to hum, a low, resonant sound that vibrated through her bones. Her reflection tilted its head, mimicking the figure from before, and reached out. She stumbled back, but the void offered no escape. The light beneath her feet flickered, and she felt the weight of the mirror pulling her down. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the attic. The mirror lay shattered at her feet, its shards reflecting fragments of the room. She gasped for air, her chest heaving, and looked around. The trunk was gone. The light from the window was warm again, the dust swirling lazily as if nothing had happened. But when she looked down at the shards, her reflection wasn't there. Instead, a faint whisper curled through the air, soft and layered, the words sinking into her skin like cold water. "You let me in." The first time I realized something was off, I was alone in my car, sitting at a red light that wouldn't change. I don't mean it stayed red for a suspiciously long time. I mean it didn't change at all. 10 minutes passed, then 15. No cars came from the other directions. No one honked or drove around me. The street was eerily empty, the world around me frozen in a strange stillness that pressed down like a heavy weight. The moment I reached for my phone to check the time, the light turned green. I drove on, my stomach tight with unease, but the feeling passed quickly. At least, that's what I told myself. It wasn't until later that night that I noticed the smudge. It was on my bathroom mirror, just above my reflection's head. At first, I thought it was grease from my hands, but the shape was too deliberate, an arching curve that almost resembled a crescent moon. I grabbed a paper towel and glass cleaner and wiped it away, though the texture felt more like wax than grease. The next morning, it was back. This time, it wasn't a crescent. It was a perfect circle. I wiped it away again, telling myself it was a trick of condensation or residue I'd missed before. But as the days passed, the marks returned, each one slightly different. A line, then a jagged zigzag, then a cluster of dots that reminded me of a constellation. They weren't random. I could feel the intent behind them, though I didn't want to admit it. One night, I covered the mirror with a towel before I went to bed. In the morning, the towel was on the floor, and the smudge had returned. That's when I noticed the changes in my reflection. At first, it was subtle. A flicker in the corner of my eye, a slight delay when I turned my head. Then it became more pronounced. My reflection smiled when I wasn't smiling. It blinked when I didn't. I started avoiding mirrors entirely, but even then, I felt watched. Every time I walked by the covered mirror, I could swear I heard the faintest creak of glass, like something shifting behind the towel. It wasn't just the mirror. Objects in my apartment began moving. Small things at first. My keys would be in the bathroom instead of on the hook by the door. My shoes would switch places. A glass I left on the counter would end up in the fridge. I assumed I was forgetting, stressed, absent-minded. But then it escalated. One morning, I woke up on the couch with no memory of falling asleep there. My bed was made, as if I'd never gotten into it. The coffee table had been pushed against the far wall, and every picture frame in the apartment had been turned face down. I didn't remember doing any of it. That night, I locked my bedroom door. At 3:11 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps. They weren't outside. They weren't in the hall or in the apartment above me. They were inside my bedroom. I stayed frozen under the covers, listening as the footsteps moved from the door to the foot of my bed. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even blink. Then they stopped. In the silence that followed, I felt a shift in the air, as if something was leaning over me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but lie there, helpless. But I couldn't move. Eventually, the feeling faded, and I must have fallen asleep out of sheer exhaustion. When I woke, the lock on my bedroom door was still latched. But my mirror was uncovered, and written across its surface in perfect symmetry was a single word: Behold. I don't know why I didn't leave. Maybe I thought leaving wouldn't matter, that whatever was happening would follow me. Or maybe I already felt too entangled in it to escape. A few days later, my reflection began talking. It didn't use my voice. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, like a whisper carried by the wind. I caught fragments of words: you, closer, watch. Then it grew clearer, louder, more insistent. It spoke to me in a voice that wasn't mine but carried the weight of something that had been inside me all along. Do you understand now? It asked one night, its lips moving when mine didn't. I shook my head, my pulse hammering. You called me, it said. Its smile stretched unnaturally wide. I didn't, I whispered. My voice trembled, barely audible. You did, it insisted. In every empty thought, in every unsaid word. You pulled me through. I stepped away from the mirror, my knees shaking. What do you want? It tilted its head, studying me. To be, it said simply. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I saw it step out of the mirror. Not completely, just enough for its hand to press against the glass, fingers impossibly long and sharp. I haven't slept since that night. The mirror is covered again, though I know it doesn't matter. I feel it in the apartment with me, its presence stretching into every shadow, every quiet moment. And sometimes, when I walk past the mirror, I feel an overwhelming urge to look, not because I want to see what's there, but because I'm afraid of what I'll see if I don't. It's waiting, and it's not waiting for me to fight. It's waiting for me to give in. I wouldn't have noticed the anomaly if it hadn't been for the scratch on my car door. It wasn't a major scratch, just a faint, looping arc on the driver's side, no deeper than a fingernail, but enough to catch my eye every time I got in. I'd been meaning to buff it out for weeks but never found the time. That morning, as I walked to my car, coffee in one hand and my keys in the other, I froze. The scratch was gone. I ran my fingers over the spot where it had been, smooth as glass, without so much as a hint of imperfection. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it. But no, I remembered it clearly, the exact curve of it, how the light would catch in the groove. I even remembered cursing under my breath about the cost of fixing it. And yet, it was as if it had never been there. On the way to work, I couldn't stop glancing at the door, half expecting the scratch to reappear. But the surface stayed flawless. I chalked it up to a shoplifting cart or a prank memory, my mind playing tricks on me in the fog of routine. But the next morning, the dent in my rear bumper vanished too. That dent had been there since the day I bought the car. A small but stubborn blemish I'd grown used to seeing in the reflection of my rearview mirror. It was gone now, the bumper perfectly smooth. At work, I mentioned it to my coworker Sam. Do you think someone could fix a car overnight without me knowing? I joked, trying to laugh off the unease that had been creeping in. Sam raised an eyebrow. You mean like car fairies? I don't know, man. Maybe you're just finally getting some good karma. We both laughed, but the hollow feeling in my chest didn't go away. The third disappearance wasn't a scratch, or a dent, or even an object. It was the old man at the corner store. Every Saturday, I stopped by the same bodega on my way home from the gym. The old man behind the counter, gray-haired, with a warm smile and a habit of humming Sinatra songs, was always there. I didn't even know his name, but we'd exchanged pleasantries for years. That Saturday, the counter was empty. I waited for a minute, then called out. A younger woman, maybe in her 20s, came out from the back room. She looked at me like I was lost. "Can I help you?" Yeah, I stammered. "Is the old guy not here today?" She frowned. "What old guy?" "The one who's always here. Gray hair, Sinatra fan. You know." Her frown deepened. "Sir, I've been running this place for 3 years. There's no old man here." I left without buying anything, my heart pounding. The disappearances accelerated after that. Subtle at first. A scratch on a lamp I'd knocked over as a kid gone. The creaky stair in my building that I always avoided, now silent and firm. My neighbor's dog, a scruffy terrier who barked at every passing car, missing from the front yard. People didn't remember the things that vanished. They looked at me blankly when I brought them up, as though I were describing a dream they had never had. Then my phone's photo album started changing. Pictures I'd taken just days ago began to warp. A shot of my living room, the coffee table in the foreground, now showed an empty floor where the table had been. A selfie from my last vacation with my sister had her face blurred, smudged into nothingness. Even older photos weren't spared. My high school graduation picture was missing half the people, their outlines faint shadows against the backdrop. I tried taking new photos, just to see if they'd hold, but by the next morning, they were gone too. My world was erasing itself. The tipping point came when I tried to call my mother. Her number had always been saved in my phone as Mom, simple and easy. But when I scrolled through my contacts, it wasn't there. I searched every corner of my phone, every app, every backup. Nothing. I typed her number manually, my hands trembling. A robotic voice answered. "The number you have dialed is not in service." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I had spoken to her just 2 days ago. I remembered the conversation vividly. She told me about a new recipe she tried, laughed about a story I'd shared from work. But now, it was as if she'd never existed. I drove to her house. The familiar blue shutters, the hydrangeas in the yard. They were all gone. The address was a vacant lot, overgrown with weeds. My stomach churned as I sat there in my car, staring at the emptiness where her home should have been. A deep, buzzing hum filled the air, faint at first but growing louder. I turned off the car and stepped outside, scanning the horizon. The world felt too quiet, as though the hum had chased away all the ambient noise. The ground beneath my feet shimmered, just for a second, and then I saw them. 3 figures, standing motionless at the edge of the lot. They weren't human. Not exactly. Their forms were faint, like static on an old television, flickering in and out of focus. No faces, no features, just silhouettes that pulsed faintly with the hum. "What do you want?" I called, my voice cracking. They didn't move. I took a step forward, and the hum grew deafening. My vision blurred, the edges of the world warping as though I were looking through water. I tried to speak again, but the words dissolved before they left my mouth. One of the figures raised a hand. Not a wave, not a threat, just a slow, deliberate gesture, like pressing a key on a piano. The hum stopped. When I woke, I was back in my apartment. The world seemed normal at first glance. The scratch was back on my car door. The dent in the bumper, the creaky stair. Everything I thought I had lost had returned. Even the old man at the corner store greeted me with a Sinatra hum when I stopped by. But things were off. The light was too even, too perfect. My apartment smelled faintly of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. And at night, when everything is still, I can hear the hum again. Low, steady, waiting. I wasn't sure why the offer unsettled me. On paper, it was everything I could have wanted. A private room in a sprawling, old Victorian house. Cheap rent, a landlord who promised to stay out of the way, and a neighborhood where the loudest sound was the occasional passing car. It was the perfect place to write, to work, to finally finish the novel that had been languishing on my laptop for years. The house itself was a little worse for wear, but it had charm. Faded wallpaper with intricate patterns, creaky wooden floors that groaned like an old man rising from a chair, windows that looked out onto a dense thicket of trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The landlord, Mr. Albright was quiet, his demeanor as soft and worn as the cardigan he seemed to live in. He gave me a quick tour, pointing out the shared kitchen, the single bathroom, and the library. When he opened the door to my room, he hesitated. "This is the one you'll be staying in," he said, lingering in the doorway as if reluctant to enter. The room was nothing special: a bed, a desk, a narrow window that let in a slant of pale light. But something about it made my chest tighten. "Perfect," I lied, stepping past him. Mr. Albright smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let me know if you need anything," he said, and then he was gone. For the first week, everything was fine. I kept to myself, writing during the day and reading at night in the library. I only saw Mr. Albright in passing, and he always seemed to be busy with some unseen task, his footsteps echoing faintly down the long, narrow halls. It wasn't until I started hearing the knocking that things began to change. The first time, it was faint, 3 soft raps on the wall behind my bed. I froze, straining to hear it again, but the house was silent. I told myself it was nothing. The house was old, and old houses make noise. But the knocking didn't stop. Every night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, it would come again. Always 3 knocks, always soft but deliberate, like someone testing the limits of my attention. I asked Mr. Albright about it once, catching him in the kitchen as he brewed a pot of tea. "Do you hear anything strange at night?" I asked. He didn't look up. "Strange?" "Knocking. On the walls." His hands stilled, just for a moment, before he resumed his task. "This house has its quirks," he said quietly. The conversation ended there. That night, the knocking grew louder. It wasn't just the wall behind my bed anymore. It seemed to come from all around me, faint raps echoing from the corners of the room, the ceiling, even the floor beneath my feet. I couldn't sleep. I paced the room, pressing my ear to the walls, trying to pinpoint the source. Each time I thought I'd found it, the sound would shift, moving somewhere else. The library became my refuge. It was the only room in the house that felt still. The air was heavy with the scent of old books, and the walls were lined with shelves that reached the ceiling. A single armchair sat near the window, its upholstery faded and worn but comfortable. It was there, late one night, that I found the journal. It wasn't shelved with the other books. It was tucked behind the armchair, its leather cover cracked and dry, its edges frayed with age. The first page was blank, but as I flipped through it, I found words scrawled in uneven handwriting. "Don't listen to them." Beneath it, another line. "It's not the house. It's the room." The rest of the journal was empty, but the words echoed in my mind. That night, I locked the door to my room, though I wasn't sure what I was trying to keep out. The knocking came again, louder than ever. This time, it was followed by a voice, soft and whispery, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Let us in." I sat frozen on the edge of the bed, my breath shallow, my eyes fixed on the door. The voice came again, closer now, slipping through the cracks in the wood. "Please." I didn't sleep. The next morning, I confronted Mr. Albright. "What's wrong with that room?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't pretend not to understand. His expression tightened, and he set down the mug of tea he'd been holding. "It's not the room," he said after a long silence. "It's what's in it." I stared at him, uncomprehending. "They don't belong here," he continued, almost to himself. "But once they've noticed you—" He trailed off, his gaze distant. I packed my things that afternoon, shoving clothes and books into a suitcase with shaking hands. But as I reached for the door, a strange heaviness settled over me, pressing against my chest. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. The room seemed to hum faintly, as though the walls themselves were alive. The air was thick, suffocating, and when I turned back toward the bed, I saw it. A shape pressed against the wall, indistinct but unmistakably human. It leaned forward, its outline rippling like water, and then it spoke. "Stay." The suitcase hit the floor, my body frozen in place. The knocking returned, louder now, more insistent, and the walls seemed to pulse with it, the rhythm driving into my skull. I don't know how I made it out of the house. The last thing I remember is the sound of the door slamming shut behind me, muffling the knocking, the voices, the hum. I never went back, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear it again. 3 soft raps against the wall, followed by a whisper. Let us in. There's a hill behind my parents' house, just steep enough that you have to lean forward when you climb it. It's unremarkable most of the year, covered in scrubby grass and dotted with wildflowers that wither by late August. At the top, there's a line of trees, their gnarled roots exposed by decades of erosion. When I was little, I used to play there with the neighborhood kids, daring each other to climb higher, to go deeper into the woods. It was on that hill, in the shadow of those trees, that I first met the girl. I was 7, maybe 8. My best friend at the time, Jonah, had dared me to climb to the highest branch of a tree we'd named the Giant. It wasn't particularly tall, but to us, it might as well have scraped the clouds. I was halfway up when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the sunlight, where the shadows grew thick. Her dress was pale, almost white, and her hair hung in long, dark waves that disappeared into the gloom. I called out to her, my voice trembling with the confidence I didn't quite feel. Hey, who are you? She didn't answer, but her head tilted slightly, like she was studying me. Jonah called up to me then, asking what I was doing, and when I glanced back down at him, she was gone. I scrambled to the ground, babbling about the girl I'd seen. Jonah teased me, called me a chicken for being distracted, but I was insistent. We searched the woods for nearly an hour, but she never reappeared. Over time, I convinced myself I'd imagined her. A trick of the light, or maybe just my overactive imagination, but the memory stayed with me, lingering like a thread I couldn't quite untangle. Years passed, and I didn't think about the girl again until I moved back home after college. My parents had offered to let me stay while I got back on my feet, and though I felt like a failure returning to my childhood bedroom, I had no better options. The hill behind the house hadn't changed much. The trees were a little sparser, the grass a little thinner, but the woods still stood at the top like silent sentinels. One evening, restless and irritable, I decided to take a walk. The air was cool, the sun sinking low enough to cast long shadows across the hill. I found myself climbing without thinking, my feet tracing the same path I'd worn as a child. When I reached the top, the woods loomed in front of me, darker than I remembered. That's when I saw her again. She was standing just inside the tree line, her pale dress almost glowing in the dim light. She looked exactly as she had all those years ago, unchanged, untouched by time. My heart raced as I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. Hey, I called, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Who are you? This time, she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped deeper into the shadows, her figure disappearing among the trees. Without thinking, I followed. The woods were quieter than they should have been. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects. Just the sound of my own footsteps crunching against the undergrowth. I called out again, but my voice felt swallowed by the silence. The deeper I went, the darker it became, the light from the setting sun fading into a pale, gray gloom. And then, I heard it. A soft, melodic hum, just ahead. It wasn't a tune I recognized, but it was strangely hypnotic, pulling me forward like an invisible thread. When I reached the source, I stopped. The girl was sitting on a fallen log, her back to me. She was humming, her voice low and sweet, but the closer I got, the more I noticed something was off. Her hair didn't move with the breeze, and her dress looked stiff, like it had been painted onto her skin. Who are you? I asked again, my voice barely above a whisper. She stopped humming. For a moment, the silence was so complete I thought I might have gone deaf. Then, slowly, she turned her head. Her face was wrong. It wasn't grotesque. There were no missing features, no monstrous distortions. But it was empty, devoid of life, like a mask carved from porcelain. Her eyes were too large, too black, and they seemed to pull at me, to pull me into them. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The girl, no, the thing, stood, her movements unnervingly fluid, and took a step toward me. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse thundering in my ears as I turned and ran. The woods seemed endless, the trees pressing in around me, their roots reaching up to trip me. I could feel her behind me, her presence like a cold weight on the back of my neck. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't stop until I burst out onto the hilltop, gasping for air. When I looked back, the woods were still, silent. She was gone. I didn't tell anyone what happened. How could I? What could I say? That I'd chased a childhood ghost into the woods and found something that shouldn't exist? But things didn't end there. At night, I started hearing the hum. Faint at first, just at the edge of hearing, like a song I couldn't quite place. It came from outside, from the direction of the hill. Sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of her in the shadows, just a flicker of movement at the corner of my vision. And the dreams were the worst. In them, I was back in the woods, running, always running. But the trees never ended, and the hum grew louder and louder until it was all I could hear. I moved out as soon as I could, but I don't think it mattered. The hum followed me. I hear it in my apartment at night, faint but persistent, like a melody I can't escape. Sometimes, I dream of her standing at the foot of my bed, her black eyes staring, unblinking, as her lips curl into a smile. I don't go home anymore. The hill can keep its secrets, but deep down, I know the girl isn't finished with me. The map wasn't supposed to exist. I found it tucked inside a thrifted book about local history, its yellowed paper brittle and creased. The book itself was dull, dry accounts of old logging operations and faded black and white photos of forgotten towns. But the map, that was something else. It was drawn by hand, every line and detail meticulous. At first, it looked like a map of the area around my town. The river winding through the woods, the familiar shapes of hills and ridges, dotted paths that marked hiking trails. But the farther my eyes traced the ink, the less sense it made. Roads veered off into nothing. Hills that didn't exist were drawn in jagged strokes. And at the center of the map was a symbol I didn't recognize. A circle surrounded by jagged lines, with the word Turnstone written underneath. Turnstone didn't exist. I grew up in this town. I'd explored every trail, driven down every winding road, and seen every corner of the surrounding woods. There was no Turnstone. Curiosity got the better of me. I set the book aside and pulled up Google Maps on my phone, scanning the area for anything remotely resembling the place on the map. Nothing. But the shape of the river and the surrounding landmarks lined up just enough to suggest that this could be real, like a distorted version of a place I knew. I told myself it was probably just an old name for something, a relic from the past. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I drove out to where Turnstone was marked. The air grew colder as I left town, the road narrowing to a single lane lined with dense pines. When I reached the point where the map claimed Turnstone should be, the road ended abruptly, swallowed by an overgrown thicket. I parked the car and got out, the silence pressing against my ears. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnaturally still. No wind, no birds, not even the distant hum of insects. I double-checked the map, and then, against all logic, I stepped into the woods. The trees were wrong. At first glance, they looked like the usual pines and oaks, their trunks stretching tall and straight. But as I walked, I noticed subtle differences. The bark had a texture that shimmered faintly, as if it was made of something smoother than wood. The branches twisted into unnatural shapes, curling into spirals that seemed too deliberate to be natural. And then there were the markings. Every so often, I'd see symbols carved into the trees, circles, triangles, jagged patterns that mirrored the drawing on the map. The deeper I went, the fresher the carvings appeared, as though someone had been making them recently. The first sign of Turnstone was the sound. It was faint at first, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground. As I moved closer, the hum grew louder, joined by other sounds. Whispers that had no source, footsteps that didn't belong to me. The air itself felt heavier, tinged with a metallic taste that coated the back of my throat. And then I saw it. The clearing appeared out of nowhere, as though the trees had decided to part just for me. At the center stood a stone structure, a crude tower no more than 10 feet tall, built from uneven slabs. It looked ancient, weathered by time, but stubbornly intact. Surrounding the tower were remnants of something. Broken tools, torn fabric, scattered bones. And in the air above the tower, faint and flickering, was the symbol from the map. It wasn't drawn. It was there, hanging in the space like a reflection on water. I didn't want to get closer, but my feet kept moving. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I felt it, a pull, deep in my chest, like a rope tied to my ribs. The closer I got to the tower, the stronger the sensation became. It wasn't just a physical pull, it was something deeper, something inside me responding to whatever this place was. I stepped into the clearing. The hum stopped. For a moment, the silence was absolute. And then, the whispering began again, louder now, words overlapping in a language I couldn't understand. The air shimmered, bending and distorting the light, and the symbol above the tower flared brighter. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the stone. It was warm. The whispers stopped. The world shifted. I don't know how to explain what happened next. It wasn't like stepping into another place. It was like the ground fell out from under me, and I was swallowed by the clearing itself. One moment, I was standing in the woods. The next, I was somewhere else entirely. The sky above was dark, a churning mass of clouds that seemed impossibly close. The trees around me were taller, their branches reaching toward the sky like grasping hands. And the tower was alive. It pulsed, its surface glowing faintly with a rhythm like a heartbeat. The carvings I'd seen on the trees now covered every inch of the stone, and they moved, shifting and rearranging themselves as I watched. I turned to run, but the clearing had disappeared. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction. The path I'd come from swallowed by the impossible landscape. Then I saw them, figures moving through the trees, too far to make out clearly. They weren't human. I could tell that much from the way they moved, their limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. They didn't seem to walk so much as glide, their bodies flickering like static. One of them turned toward me. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was blank, a smooth surface that reflected the pulsing glow of the tower. It tilted its head, and I felt that pull again, stronger this time, dragging me toward it. I stumbled backward, the ground beneath me shifting like liquid. My hand brushed something cold, and I realized I was still holding the map. Without thinking, I unfolded it. The ink had changed. The pads on the map now twisted and curled, forming a single line that led back to the symbol at the center. Beneath it, in fresh, dark letters, were two words: "Don't stop." I ran. The figures followed, their movements silent but relentless. The woods blurred around me, the trees bending and twisting as if alive. I didn't know where I was going. I just followed the line on the map, my legs burning, my lungs screaming. At some point, I tripped. The map flew from my hands, landing just out of reach. As I scrambled to grab it, I saw one of the figures closing in, its featureless face tilting toward me. And then I was back. The woods were normal again. The clearing was gone. The map lay on the ground, blank and brittle. Its ink vanished. I don't know how I got out or why, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the hum. On the morning of the garden party, I found the note. It wasn't hidden or tucked away. It was pinned to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. The handwriting wasn't his. It was looping and neat, the kind of handwriting that suggests a patient, deliberate person. "See you tonight. Bring the wine. Can't wait." I stood there for a moment, holding the fridge door open, my eyes skimming over the note again and again, as if it might morph into something more innocent if I stared hard enough. It didn't. "Do we have any sparkling water left?" His voice startled me. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, barefoot and calm, the picture of domesticity. He saw the note in my hand and froze, his expression tightening just slightly, just enough for me to notice. "What's this?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He walked over, plucked the note from my hand, and studied it with exaggerated confusion. "Oh, that must have been left by one of the caterers. They were here early this morning, setting up. The caterers wrote you a note asking you to bring wine?" His mouth opened, then closed. He laughed, a little too loudly. "It's probably a mix-up. Don't worry about it. He crumpled the note in his hand and tossed it into the trash. The explanation didn't sit right. I'd booked the caterers. They weren't due until noon. The garden party went off without a hitch. Guests sipped champagne and mingled beneath strings of fairy lights. He moved through the crowd with ease, laughing, chatting, charming everyone in his path. I watched him from the corner of the patio, studying the way his hand lingered on someone's shoulder, the way his eyes darted to his phone every few minutes. After the guests had gone and the house was quiet, I went back to the trash can. The crumpled note was still there. I smoothed it out and stared at the words again. They didn't change. The next day, I noticed other things. His phone, which he usually left on the kitchen counter, was now glued to his side. He took it with him everywhere, even to the shower. His scent had changed, too, something woodsy and sharp, replacing the subtle citrus cologne he'd worn for years. "You smell different," I said one evening as he passed me in the hallway. He paused, then smiled. "New cologne. You like it?" "It's strong." His smile faltered. "I'll go back to the old one if you prefer." He kissed my cheek and walked away, but the interaction left a bitter taste in my mouth. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, we'd been together for nearly a decade. People change, habits evolve, but the doubt kept gnawing at me, a relentless ache I couldn't ignore. It wasn't until I found the second note that the pieces began to fall into place. This one wasn't left in the open. It was tucked inside his jacket pocket, folded into a neat square. "Last night was amazing. Same time next week?" I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I started watching more closely. His patterns became a map I couldn't stop tracing. Tuesday nights were always late meetings, and Saturday afternoons were spent at the gym. His explanations were vague but consistent, rehearsed to the point of perfection. One Tuesday, I decided to follow him. He left the house in his usual blazer and slacks, carrying a leather briefcase. I waited 10 minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out the door. He didn't go to the office. Instead, he drove across town to a small boutique hotel. I parked a block away and watched as he walked inside, his posture relaxed, his movements easy. An hour passed, then two. When he finally emerged, he wasn't alone. The woman from the hotel was younger than me, with dark hair that tumbled down her back in loose waves. She laughed as he held the door open for her, and the sound cut through me like glass. When he came home that night, he kissed me on the forehead and said he was exhausted from work. I nodded, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. The next day, I packed his things. I didn't leave a note or an explanation. Just 2 suitcases by the front door and a text that read, "Don't come back." He tried to call, but I didn't answer. I sat in the living room, listening to the silence, letting it fill the spaces he used to occupy. Months later, I ran into him at a cafe. He was with her, the woman from the hotel. They looked happy, their laughter spilling into the air like champagne bubbles. He saw me and hesitated, his smile faltering for a moment before he turned back to her. I didn't approach them. I didn't need to. As I walked home, the sun broke through the clouds, painting the street in golden light. For the first time in a long time, I felt weightless, as if I'd shed not just him, but the doubts and shadows he'd brought with him. Some betrayals don't break you. They free you. The job posting was vague, almost laughably so. Night clerk needed. Isolated location. High pay. Little work required. It felt like the kind of ad that led to pyramid schemes or horror movies, but I was desperate, and desperate people stop caring about red flags. I responded. A reply came almost immediately, giving me directions to a building I'd never heard of and a start time of 11 p.m. It wasn't until after I accepted that I realized I hadn't even been told what the job entailed. The location turned out to be a plain, nondescript office building on the outskirts of town. The sign out front read, simply, Praxis. The parking lot was empty except for a single black sedan, its windows so tinted they might as well have been painted. Inside, the lobby was barren. No receptionist, no artwork, no plants, just white walls and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly. A man in a dark suit was waiting for me by the elevators. His face was so unremarkable that I forgot it the moment I looked away. "You're the new night clerk," he said. It wasn't a question. I guess so, I replied, shifting uncomfortably. What exactly am I? Your duties are simple, he interrupted. Stay at the desk. Answer the phone if it rings. Do not leave the building until your shift ends. He handed me a badge with my name already printed on it. There was no logo, just the word Praxis in small, block letters. Before I could ask anything else, he stepped into the elevator and disappeared. The desk he'd mentioned was on the top floor, in the corner of a massive open space filled with rows of cubicles. Everything was pristine. Papers neatly stacked, computers dark and silent, but the air felt wrong, stale, as if no one had been there for years. The desk itself was bare except for a phone and a small monitor displaying a grid of security camera feeds. I sat down and waited. For the first hour, nothing happened. The camera feeds showed empty hallways and offices, the only movement the occasional flicker of a fluorescent light. The phone sat silently in its cradle. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but the signal was non-existent, and the Wi-Fi password I'd been given didn't work. By the second hour, the stillness had begun to press in on me. The building was too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights and the occasional creak of the desk chair as I shifted. I told myself the pay was worth it. The phone rang for the first time at 12:47 a.m. I jumped, the sharp sound cutting through the silence like a knife. For a moment, I just stared at it, unsure of what to do. Then I picked up. Hello? A woman's voice came through, clear but calm. Do not look at the cameras. What? I glanced instinctively at the monitor. Do not look at the cameras, she repeated. Then the line went dead. I hung up slowly, my hand trembling. My eyes flicked to the monitor, where the feed still displayed the same empty hallways and offices. Nothing had changed, but something about the grid felt different. The shadows seemed darker, the angles subtly off. I leaned closer, squinting at one of the screens. Was that a figure standing at the end of the hallway? I looked away before I could be sure. For the next hour, I kept my eyes fixed on the desk, determined not to look at the monitor. I wanted to leave, but the man's instructions echoed in my head. Do not leave the building until your shift ends. The memory of his voice felt less like advice and more like a warning. At 2:03 a.m., the phone rang again. This time, I answered immediately. Hello? You looked, didn't you? The woman's voice was softer now, almost sympathetic. No, I stammered. I didn't. I swear. You shouldn't lie, she said. It doesn't like liars. The line went dead again. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at the monitor before I could stop myself. The figure was closer now, standing just outside the cubicles. It wasn't a person, not really. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. The camera feed flickered, and for a brief moment, its face, or where a face should have been, snapped toward the camera. My breath caught in my throat. I turned the monitor off. For the next hour, I sat motionless, staring straight ahead. The hum of the lights seemed louder now, almost like a low, guttural growl. The silence pressed against my ears, thick and oppressive. At 3:22 a.m., the elevator dinged. My heart stopped. I hadn't touched the elevator, and there was no one else in the building. I waited, breathless, for the doors to slide open. They didn't. The sound hung in the air, an open question with no answer. Then I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the far end of the cubicles. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. Something moving closer, its presence pressing against my skin like static electricity. The phone rang again. I snatched it up, desperate for a voice, any voice, to break the terror. Hello? I whispered. Don't move, the woman said. It's looking for you. The footsteps stopped. The air grew heavy, charged with a presence I couldn't see but could feel, like a weight pressing against my chest. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Why is this happening? I whispered into the phone. The woman didn't answer. The line was silent, but I could still hear her breathing. The footsteps started again, slower this time, circling the desk. My eyes stayed locked on the grain of the wood, refusing to look up. Then the phone went dead. When the morning shift arrived at 7 a.m., I was still sitting at the desk, my hands gripping the edge so tightly my knuckles had turned white. The man in the dark suit appeared beside me, his face as unreadable as ever. "Congratulations," he said. "You made it." I didn't ask him what he meant. I just handed him the badge and walked out of the building, vowing never to return. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear the phone ringing.